Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth Noise Policy Review webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Don Scotta, and I manage the Noise Division in FAA's Office of Environment and Energy. As we were preparing for today's webinar, we realized that there was a difference between the times for today's webinar in the Federal Register notice and on our webpage and other materials. Our Federal Register notice stated that today's webinar was to start right now at 3 o'clock Eastern and would run until 5 o'clock. However, our webpage and other materials stated that the webinar would run between 4 and 6 p.m. Eastern. I'm sorry about this mistake. In order to rectify it, we've decided to extend today's webinar to be from 3 to 6 Eastern to encompass the extent of both published times. For those of you that are on right now, we're going to start with our presentation and then switch to the Q&A. At about 4 o'clock, we'll pause the Q&A and I'll come back to share a similar message with new attendees. At that point, we'll replay the presentation, and when it's over, restart the Q&A, which will continue until 6 o'clock Eastern. Again, I apologize for the confusion about today's webinar time. It was a mistake, and hopefully you agree that our plan to address it makes sense and provides everyone that planned to join an opportunity to participate. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. The presentation will start momentarily. Welcome to our Noise Policy Review webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Don Scotta, and I manage the Noise Division in FAA's Office of Environment and Energy. I will be presenting some information regarding FAA's Noise Policy Review. Following this presentation, we will host a live question and answer session. The entirety of today's webinar will be recorded and posted to FAA's YouTube channel and our Noise Policy Review webpage at faa.gov/noise policy review. Throughout this presentation and during the question and answer session following this presentation, you may submit questions by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. There is no need to wait. You will not be able to see questions asked by others. However, you will see your own questions. If we receive similar questions, we will combine them into one question. You may also submit questions to FAA's YouTube channel if watching live. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during this webinar. Please note, questions and comments made during this webinar will not be recorded to the federal docket. To make an official comment, a link to the Federal Register notice is available at faa.gov/noise policy review. In late 2021, the FAA initiated a review of our noise policy as a part of our ongoing commitment to address aircraft noise. This effort will build on our work to advance the scientific understanding of noise impacts, as well as the development of analytical tools and technologies. It will consider new evidence from the agency's noise research program, including from the Neighborhood Environmental Survey, and the distribution of environmental risks, trade-offs, or externalities across communities. Our goals are to identify and implement well-reasoned, scientifically grounded noise policy updates that incorporate FAA's updated understanding of aviation noise and human response, and the development of analytical tools and technologies to better manage and reduce the environmental impacts of aviation. We also aim to conduct an inclusive, transparent, and participatory process that prioritizes input from substantially affected stakeholders, including local communities. The FAA published our Noise Policy Review Federal Register Notice on Monday, May 1st, 2023. That publication started a 90-day comment period that ends on Monday, July 31st, 2023. The Federal Register Notice includes a brief background on FAA's noise policy and also links to a companion framing paper. The request for comments includes 11 questions. Respondents don't have to answer every question when submitting their response to the docket. The companion framing paper is entitled The Foundational Elements of the Federal Aviation Administration Civil Aviation Noise Policy, the Noise Measurement System, its component noise metrics, and noise thresholds. The framing paper was designed to be read in parallel with the Federal Register Notice. It provides additional context and discussion around the 11 questions included in the notice, and provides context for the review. We wrote it to help aviation stakeholders better understand the questions included in the Federal Register Notice. The scope of this Federal Register Notice is on the foundational elements of FAA's noise policy, metrics and noise thresholds. Regarding metrics, we are taking a hard look at the day-night average sound level and are considering other metrics, such as number above, as well as how each of those metrics are calculated. Regarding noise threshold, in light of neighborhood environmental survey findings and other research, we are considering whether to lower below DNL 65 dBA the definition of the level of significant noise exposure for actions subject to environmental review, and are also considering modifying the definitions of the levels of noise exposure that are deemed normally compatible with airport operations, as set forth in Part 150. The FAA recognizes that aviation noise is a pivotal quality of life issue for some. Aviation noise experiences differ. Communities and individuals have different interests, values, and concerns, and the information about aviation noise that is sought may differ. At the same time, the FAA is developing a policy that will apply to the national airspace system with a large number of stakeholders, those who operate in the system, the traveling public, and those affected on the ground. The interests and concerns of these parties are different, representing different interests, concerns, and priorities. The FAA is committed to ensuring that we provide meaningful, equitable, and transparent access to all stakeholders during this process. The public comment period helps us accomplish that goal. Further, it provides opportunities for us to engage with the public and stakeholders in a consistent way so that FAA understands how we jointly view the noise problem and begin to think about potential solutions or improvements to the way our agency interacts with the public and explains how their experience of aviation noise will change over time as a result of FAA action. Now is the time to provide input, as FAA has not yet made any decisions regarding what, if any, of its noise policy will be updated. Your input will help us understand how we can improve community understanding and expectations regarding future noise exposure, and also how FAA makes decisions regarding the topic. The questions in the Federal Register notice are designed to get input that will supplement our technical expertise and consideration of aviation noise issues. We welcome any comments that our stakeholders are willing to provide, and are particularly interested in the public's response to the questions and issues identified in the notice. We are looking for specific recommendations, explanation for any recommended changes, and supporting information or data. Comments addressing potential improvements in how, where, and with whom FAA communicates changes in aircraft noise exposure will be particularly helpful. Please note, comments regarding the level of aviation noise at specific locations should be made on the FAA Noise portal at the link provided. The request for comments provides an opportunity for knowledge and potential solutions to flow from the public to the policymakers at the FAA. Our agency recognizes that those affected by our policies will have views and ideas on them and how they can be improved. We are eager to hear your input and understand your reasoning. The FAA requests your substantive comments. You may ask what that means. A non-substantive comment is one that is not related to the issue under consideration and does not offer data or information that can influence the policy outcome. For example, a noise complaint regarding aviation activity over a specific location is non-substantive and should be directed to the FAA Noise portal. 3 types of comments can provide substantive input for agency decision makers to weigh. First, comments regarding scientific or economic evidence and specialized expert knowledge relevant to the topic at hand are helpful. For example, comments that explain what information is not currently provided by the DNL noise metric that may be disclosed by the application of another noise metric are helpful. So too would a comment that provides information about the economic impact of a different noise threshold, including describing how the conclusion was drawn, what data was relied upon, and what assumptions were made in the analysis. Comments should explain how they are supported by data and why the commenter believes that they are backed up by best available science. Second, comments that point to factual or legal flaws in current or proposed policies, identify gaps between agency policy and legal requirements, or why the policy does not adequately resolve the problem it is intended to address, and discuss the likely unintended consequences of an agency policy. Finally, submissions that provide alternative solutions or enhancements to the rule and explain why these proposals are better suited to resolve the issue than the policy intends to address. This slide presents a collective view on historic and current noise problems. Historically, noise issues were airport-centric, result of infrequent operations and dispersed flight paths, and very loud jet aircraft. Noise concerns were raised primarily by communities immediately adjacent to airports, and communities' lived experience included low cadence of relatively loud aircraft noise events separated by long intervals. Our current noise problem is an airspace or overflight noise problem, resulting from frequent operations, concentrated flight paths, relatively quiet aircraft, and noise concerns raised primarily by corridor communities further from airports. Communities' lived experience includes a high cadence of daily, relatively quiet aircraft noise events separated by short intervals. In addition, there's been an introduction of new entrant and commercial space operations. Now we're going to start unpacking some of the questions in the Federal Register notice. Questions 1 and 2A request information about the aircraft and vehicle types and operations that the policy should address, looking at fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, rockets, future supersonic aircraft, or new entrant technologies like UA, drones, or advanced air mobility aircraft such as air taxi. How and what elements of the operations should be described using noise metrics, and how information should be used by the FAA to communicate with the public regarding changes in noise exposure and to make decisions. Question 2B through E asks things like who is and will be affected by aviation noise in the vicinity of airport versus overflight communities, in the vicinity of commercial space launch or re-entry operations, the vicinity of UAS or other newly emerging technology operations. How has your experience of noise changed over time? How do your interests and concerns differ from others based on your location and experience of aviation operations? How would different noise metrics address these concerns? Congress directed the FAA to establish a single system of measuring noise in the Aviation Safety and Noise Abatement Act of 1979, what we call ASNA. The system must have highly reliable relationship between projected noise exposure and surveyed reactions of individuals to noise, and be applied uniformly in measuring noise at airports and the surrounding area. The single system must account for noise intensity, duration, frequency, and time of occurrence. FAA's noise metric system relies primarily on the day-night average sound level, or DNL. It is a single number metric to quantify cumulative aircraft noise exposure over a 24-hour period, accounting for noise intensity and magnitude, duration of exposure, frequency or number of events, and the time period in which events occur, such as day or night. It's FAA's primary decision metric for actions subject to NEPA and airport noise compatibility planning studies prepared pursuant to 14 CFR Part 150. Question 3 asks about the DNL metric as a whole. What views or comments do you have regarding DNL? About its benefits or shortcomings? Would these views change if another metric was used as a companion, supplement, or alternative to DNL? A companion metric is a noise metric that is used in conjunction with another noise metric, such as DNL, for decision making. A supplemental metric is a noise metric used to improve the public's understanding of the expected change in aviation noise that is not used for decision making. An alternative metric is a noise metric that is used in lieu of another metric, such as DNL, for decision making. Would these views change if FAA changed how DNL is calculated? Question 4 asks about the calculation of DNL and averaging. DNL is calculated using the concept of an average annual day, which averages annual aircraft operations into a single representative day. Do you believe average annual day appropriately describes noise impacts? What other averaging schemes should be considered, and what do they capture that average annual day does not? Question 5 asks about possible decision-making metrics and how they can interact. What noise metrics should be used for decision-making for actions subject to NEPA and airport noise compatibility planning studies prepared pursuant to 14 CFR Part 150? Should different metrics be used in different circumstances? If so, how? Should FAA continue to use DNL for decision-making? How can metrics be used to support better agency decision-making? The FAA is reviewing many metrics that could be considered as a part of that system, including both cumulative metrics, such as the traditional DNL or CNEL, but also other cumulative metrics, such as an 8-hour day, which could be used to evaluate school and work settings. We will also review a range of operational single event metrics, including number above, time above, Lmax, and others that might be suggested. Finally, we are working closely with FAA's Office of Commercial Space to evaluate metrics that are more appropriate for low frequency or impulsive noise, such as commercial space launches. The most appropriate metric could depend on the purpose of the analysis, the audience, and several other factors. Changes to DNL could include changes to adjusting the threshold, averaging technique, and/or changes to its nighttime weighting. DNL with additional supplemental metrics can be used together. Number above, or NA, answers how often will the aircraft level meet or exceed a certain level. Time above, or TA, answers how long will the sound last at or above a certain level. Number above and time above break the DNL metric into its component parts to help explain the noise exposure in a different way. Question 6 asks about communicating changes in noise exposure. FAA's current supplemental noise metric policy is contained in FAA's NEPA policies and procedures, FAA Order 1050.1F. The FAA uses the policy to engage with the public to better explain changes in noise exposure. Supplemental metrics are not used for decision-making. If the FAA were to change this policy, should FAA consider what information FAA communicates regarding changes in noise exposure, where and with whom FAA communicates, what information methods FAA uses to communicate, what venues FAA uses to share information regarding changes in noise exposure? FAA noise thresholds refer to two different levels. FAA significant noise impact threshold for actions being reviewed under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and the Land Use Compatibility Guidelines established in 14 CFR Part 150, Appendix A. Noise thresholds are informed by a historic dose-response curve called the Schultz curve, which provided a useful method for representing the community response to aircraft noise. Both are set at DNL 65 dB. Regarding noise thresholds, question 7 asks, how should historic and neighborhood environmental survey findings be considered in establishing a noise threshold for actions subject to NEPA and land use noise thresholds in 14 CFR Part 150? Should FAA consider other information regarding noise impacts in establishing noise metrics? Should the noise thresholds be established using DNL or another cumulative noise metric? Question 8 asks, should FAA establish noise thresholds using single event or operational metrics for certain types of actions subject to FAA approval or control? When should FAA use these metrics? What should be the level of noise exposure that defines the limits of significant noise exposure in NEPA analyses and for actions subject to 14 CFR Part 150? Question 9 asks about low frequency and impulsive noise events. Should the FAA establish noise thresholds for certain types of actions subject to FAA approval or control, such as when the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation authorizes launch and reentry of commercial space transportation vehicles? What should be the level of noise exposure that defines the limits of significant noise exposure in NEPA analyses and for actions subject to 14 CFR Part 150? Question 11 references the body of scientific and economic literature compiled by the FAA regarding the way aviation noise correlates with annoyance, as well as environmental, economic, and health impacts. It refers the public to Appendix 1, which synthesizes health impacts, such as cardiovascular, sleep, mental health, birth outcomes, and children's learning. Also, it looks at annoyance, noise effects, noise level recommendations, alternative metrics, flight track dispersion, military jet noise, and mental health. It looks at economics and things like health costs and home values, and also summarizes synthesis research. Question 10 asks, what other issues or topics should the FAA consider in this review regarding noise metrics? The method of calculating them, the establishment of noise thresholds, or FAA's method of communicating the change in noise exposure? We ask the public to please explain their response. This noise policy review could have a number of potential outcomes. It could result in FAA updating our regulations, orders, guidance, etc. For example, FAA might revise the threshold of noise-sensitive land use compatibility for 14 CFR Part 150 and/or environmental reviews. It might also provide additional guidance on how to prepare those documents. It could result in different levels of analysis and review for a particular action, such as a change in a flight procedure. And it could result in identifying better ways of communicating with the public about the effects of noise. While this policy review is an important step for the FAA to take, it is critical that we are transparent and clear about the effect any policy changes could have on existing noise exposure. There are some things that will not be affected by any policy changes being considered in this review. Changes in policy alone will not reduce noise exposure. For future environmental reviews, a change in policy could result in different outcomes that may have reduced impacts depending on what alternatives are available and the specific federal action being considered. The proposed policy changes we are talking about here will not change where and when aircraft currently fly. However, as just mentioned, future decisions would take into account the new policy and may result in less impactful outcomes. And finally, policy changes will not require FAA to redo any environmental analyses or decisions that have been made. Future environmental reviews completed after any policy changes were implemented would take into account any changes. For additional information, you can visit our Noise Policy Review webpage at faa.gov/noise policy review. You can also email us for additional information at noisepolicyreview@faa.gov or leave us a voicemail by calling 202-269-6999. Now we're going to shift gears for our Q&A session. Our Q&A session is about to begin. You may submit questions by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. You will not be able to see questions asked by others. However, you will see your own questions. If we receive similar questions, we will combine them into one question. You may also submit questions to FAA's YouTube channel if watching live. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during this webinar. Please note, questions and comments made during this webinar will not be recorded to the federal docket. To make an official comment, a link to the Federal Register notice is available at faa.gov/noise policy review. And now I'd like to introduce today's panelists. As I've already introduced myself, I will start with Adam Schulten. Adam is an environmental protection specialist in the Noise Division of FAA's Office of Environment and Energy. Adam has 13 years of experience working in aviation, 8 of which have been in the environmental field. Adam began his aviation environmental career as a consultant specializing in airport noise before joining the FAA in 2021. As a consultant, Adam conducted noise modeling utilizing FAA tools such as the Aviation Environmental Design Tool, and worked extensively to support airports and community roundtables to analyze aircraft flight procedures and provide guidance on the development of alternative procedures that could help to reduce noise exposure. Since joining FAA, Adam has focused on developing methodologies to assist the FAA in assessing noise associated with unmanned aircraft and working with others in the Noise Division to launch the FAA's Noise Policy Review. Andrew Brooks is the Regional Environmental Program Manager for FAA's Eastern Region Airports Division. Andrew has over 24 years of experience working in the environmental field, 21 of which are with the Federal Aviation Administration. He began his career with the Environmental Protection Agency before joining the FAA in 2002 as an environmental protection specialist. He has served as the Eastern Region Environmental Program Manager for Airports Division for the last 11 years, managing complex environmental projects and noise compatibility planning on behalf of the FAA across 7 states in the District of Columbia. Andrew is a national expert on aviation noise and compatibility planning and has been an instructor for the FAA's Noise and Land Use Compatibility Planning course for the past 7 years. Ryan Weller is an environmental protection specialist for the FAA's Western Service Center. He started his FAA career in the Northwest Mountain Technical Operations Division in 2001 and moved to the Western Service Center in 2007. Prior to federal service, Ryan worked in private industry in the chemical and hazardous waste industry. Ryan has managed environmental reviews for regional and local airspace redesign projects, along with military special use airspace projects. Thank you again for participating in this webinar. As we begin the Q&A session, I'd like to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras. We will begin the Q&A momentarily. Okay, welcome again to our Noise Policy Review webinar and this afternoon's Q&A session. This is the fourth of our public workshops to share the same information and experience for all interested members of the public. We hope that today's presentation answered some of your questions, and we'll answer as many of the relevant questions as we can in today's Q&A session. As a reminder, you can submit questions via the Q&A box on Zoom or as a comment on the YouTube live stream. We want to be respectful of your time and considerate to those who have specific questions related to the noise policy review. We are here to answer those questions. We will not be able to answer questions about any other topic or address noise complaints related to specific locations. As a reminder, you can submit your noise complaints to FAA at our noise portal at https://noise.faa.gov. Thank you very much. Looks like we have a few questions in the queue. First one, maybe Adam, you can take this one on. How is the stance of FAA using number above, say, I guess N60, as an official metric in aircraft noise impact analysis and set as an action level above that?
That's a good question. And as part of the policy review, we're considering multiple metrics that may be used to communicate and disclose impacts to the public or for decision-making purposes as it relates to noise. And these metrics include number above, a specified maximum sound level, such as was noted in the comment. But we're considering other metrics that generally fall into a few other different categories, such as cumulative metrics, single event or operational metrics, or low frequency and impulsive metrics. We're also going to be considering the different operational scenarios or instances where these metrics could or should be used, and are thinking about things such as the type of the vehicle being analyzed, the purpose of the analysis, or the type of analysis for which is being completed. So we welcome your views if you believe other considerations should come into play into this context. And part of looking at these different metrics is we're also going to consider if and how potential metrics may or may not be used together. And it's important, I think, for us to clarify that as part of the policy review, as noted, there was reference to an official metric in the comment, but we may not adopt a single official metric, but rather may adapt a suite of metrics that may be used separately in combination with, or may supplement one another. And some may be used for decision-making purposes. Others may not, and may only be used to provide communities with additional information and context regarding, expected changes in their noise environment and to better communicate noise impacts.
Thanks, Adam. Ryan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of add on to that as far as the metrics and the thresholds and so forth. The things we'll be considering is really using a single metric as a replacement for DNL for decision-making purposes, which we are kind of defining as the alternative metric in the context of this policy review. We're also considering multiple metrics, and I think Adam mentioned the suite. And so that's a combination of one or another for decision-making, which will be defined as kind of the companion metric. Also, we'll be looking at metrics for supplemental to the decision-making process. So, and that's just to be able to better communicate noise exposure for added transparency and communication, but not use those metrics for necessary decision-making, but just as a supplemental metric is what we'd be calling those. And again, in regards to these metrics, we're talking about also in this process is the thresholds. And we'll be considering how to establish those significant thresholds Currently, we have the DNL at the 65 dB level. But that's up for consideration in this process, especially with our NEPA, and also to define the noise exposure that's considered for the non-compatible land use for the airport operations in the Part 150 regs. So we'll be thinking about all these in the process, and we welcome anyone's comment in regards to that, in particular if it's the NA60 or any other metric that's out there. I think the information was kind of asked in the opening questions. I know Don went over those questions, and I think they're in the Federal Register, but question 3 was really towards that alternative supplemental and companion noise metric. And so if you're going to provide comments, it would be kind of under that question 3. And then for question 5, that was more of the decision-making metric. And that has some connection to what we were talking about here today. So when you do provide comments, I'd kind of look, if this is your area of interest, it's question 3 and question 5 in the Federal Register. Thanks, Don.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ryan and Adam. Next question, maybe Ryan, you can take this one for us, if you don't mind. The question is, are the environmental justice or EJ analyses available on the FAA website, or are they made public? Or how do the folks that are interested access internal environmental justice data to determine policy regarding noise?
Okay, yeah, and we're using that term kind of interchangeably. We mention it as EJ sometimes, but it's the environmental justice, and the FAA does conduct the environmental justice analysis in the context of a project or a specific action. So if we have a project where we're changing something that's subject to NEPA, then we would do this environmental justice review. But not all of those reviews are necessarily provided in a public forum. It really depends on the project. I've seen some projects that aren't required to be publicly projected, and we actually do put them out there. So it really depends on the project and kind of the scope of what we're doing there. The environmental justice, the information we use for that analysis is it's a public site that anyone can go in and take a look at. If you want to look for EJ communities, it's under the EPA website. So it's, if you type in epa.gov/EJ screen, that will put you into that tool, and it's really helpful. And you can go into the communities, into very small areas that you're interested in, and see what kind of communities that are out there. So I will say that the 1050 really does set the policies and procedures on how we do our EJ analysis, and it requires us to do the socioeconomic, environmental justice, and the children's environmental health and safety risk analysis. That same order, the 1050, which is kind of our driving force for most of our environmental analysis, also sets forth how we provide these analysis publicly and which ones are required to be and which ones are not. So I'd point folks in both those locations, the EJ screen or the 1050, that's on our website. But if there's any comments in regards to the environmental justice, developing policy around environmental justice analysis, this is an excellent opportunity to provide those kind of comments to the docket. And those are things that we want to hear about, whether the current metrics and policies that we're abiding under today, if those are adequate, or if you have suggestions on how to improve them, either through a new metric or a new threshold. That's exactly what we want to hear and get out of this process. We devoted a lot of time and energy, 4 sessions into this process. So the FAA is really making a big effort to get the word out that we have a public comment period that goes through the end of July 31st. So folks still have time to submit their comments, and I certainly encourage everyone to do that. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Ryan. Andrew, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, Don, thank you. I just want to clarify, in Ryan's response, he indicated that not all of the analyses subject to NEPA are publicly available, and that is correct. But those projects where we do trigger an environmental justice analysis because we're examining impacts that may disproportionately fall on minority or low-income communities. We do meet the requirements of the executive orders for environmental justice, including engagement with those communities about impacts and mitigation. So when environmental justice in and of itself is triggered, there is a public-facing component to those analyses. Typically, we're doing those in an environmental assessment level at that point. The majority of our categorical exclusions, which don't get shared via public unless there also is a triggering action requiring those as well. If we do find that we're encountering an environmental justice issue as we're reviewing a proposed categorical exclusion, we will consider that a potential extraordinary circumstance that will then up-level the analysis under NEPA from a categorical exclusion to an environmental assessment. So I did just want to clarify that, data regarding EJ in and of itself, when EJ issues are triggered, are typically in those documents that are already public, and that there's not a set of documents that don't go to the public that also would contain EJ analyses. But I want to echo Ryan's position on EJ Screen as a tool. It's very informative. It's the tool that we as an agency use to identify environmental justice populations rather. And it's available for anyone in the public to use. So, the person was wondering about what internal EJ data we use to determine policy regarding noise. I know we're talking about the response in a NEPA context, but we would use the similar tool when we're assessing policy issues. We would look to EJ Screen data, which includes data down to census block level based on the latest census. Of course, the most recent one was 2020. So thank you, Don.
You're welcome. Thank you, Andrew. Next question, maybe Adam, you can take this one on. The Schultz curve showed that about 12% of the population were highly annoyed at 65 dB DNL. How did the FAA arrive at DNL 65 dB as the best threshold? Besides population annoyance, what other specific factors did the FAA take into account?
That's a good question. And as noted in the comment, our current significance threshold is set as DNL 65 dB. And where that really came from and was informed by was the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, 1974 report entitled Information on Levels of Environmental Noise Requisite to Protect Public Health and Welfare with an Adequate Margin of Safety. Our thinking on the issue was also informed by the work of the Federal Interagency Committee on Urban Noise, or FAA. I'm sure not many of the folks on this webinar are familiar with FAA, but for information purposes, it was an interagency committee that shared a common goal of protecting public health and welfare regarding noise. And through the involvement of multiple federal agencies, that the FAA could reach conclusions that could provide guidance to those agencies to adopt and implement consistent with their operational requirements and provide consistency in the federal approach for aircraft noise analysis and NEPA, in NEPA documents. So in 1980, FAA issued their own report entitled The Guidelines for Considering Noise in Land Use Planning and Control, which, like the EPA, determined that on the basis of the best available science and technology and research at that time, that a threshold of DNL 65 dB represented the best balance between not only protecting public health and welfare, but also for accounting for what federal agencies could actually implement that would be economically and technically feasible at that time.
Thanks, Adam. Andrew, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, Don. So, Adam mentioned that FAA was working with FAA. We, in fact, were DOT's representative to FAA through the early 80s. And in 1980 is when the Airport Safety and Noise Abatement Act, or ANSA, was passed, which was the law that required us to establish a single system for noise analysis. And that's kind of the crux of, the NPR in and of itself. So around the time that we were engaged on FICON and had this requirement from Congress to establish this single system, we looked around at kind of what the lay of the land was in terms of research and the focus. And at that time, the Schultz curve was kind of the state of the art. Community annoyance was the primary factor. It was selected because it was representative on a cumulative metric analysis basis. Again, correlating to annoyance, but a cumulative metric was selected as another factor that we considered because it allowed us to consider ramifications of situations, whereas single events would only give us, if one runway at an airport was operating and another wasn't, and we were using a single event type of metric, we wouldn't really be able to compare that directly per se to what happens, when the other runway was being used. So averaging it out gave us a way to kind of factor out all the operations, how often they were used, and get a more representative analytical tool at that time. And again, the data showed that it was correlated to annoyance. So when we promulgated the Part 150 regulations, where we stood up our single standard for noise in response to the requirement from Congress in 1980, we stood those regulations up in 1985. We picked 65 DNL based on the requirements of again, congressional directive and where the research with FICON was at the time. And since then, FICON has evolved somewhat. It's been superseded by FICON, the Federal Interagency Committee on Noise, and then FICAN, which is the Federal Interagency Committee on Aircraft Noise. And FAA has continued with many of the same representatives in that fashion. Revisitation of the Schultz curve analysis was done by the U.S. Air Force in the early 90s. It kind of validated the findings in terms of correlation to annoyance at that time. But that was the most recent correlation or validation of the findings that was done until the Neighborhood Environmental Survey. So, it's because of all of these issues, the age of the data, the age of the correlation, the findings of the Neighborhood Environmental Survey that have led us now to kind of the noise policy review. And in that context, as you can see by the questions that Don went through in the presentation that he offered to open the session today, we're really asking for additional input on other factors that should be considered above and beyond annoyance. We have a good understanding of which metrics could apply to other factors to consider, such as speech interference or sleep interference, but there are other specifically directed questions in the 11 questions in the Federal Register notice to kind of assist in an open solicitation for data points that we should factor in establishing our new single system for analysis. And as was previously touched on, I think Adam touched on this in response to the first question, our current single system is one metric applies everywhere. And what we're looking to do via NPR is to kind of have a more adaptable, situationally based single system still, but that applies more flexibility and allows for consideration of different metrics given the aircraft type or the resources affected. So thank you, Don.
You're welcome. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks for connecting the dots between FICON, FICON, and FICAN. Folks that have been with us before have heard us talking about the other two organizations. So I think that was great context. Let's see. Next question. The public has provided feedback for 6+ years since NextGen was launched on metrics, thresholds, issues, etc. This process sounds like we're starting over from scratch versus FAA commenting on what it heard as a starting point. I can take this one on for us. All right, so we're certainly aware that we've been hearing from members of the public on an individual project basis as we've been implementing NextGen, and folks have been sharing with us for even longer, their views on our various noise metrics that we have, specifically DNL, but also some of the other supplemental metrics that we've used. We also know that many stakeholders decided to participate in our noise research Federal Register notice back in 2021, where we received more than 4,000 comments in our Federal Register notice on the docket from those interested stakeholders. We're certainly not starting from scratch this time, because we've heard all that feedback already, but we also need to make sure that we're providing everyone an inclusive, transparent, and participatory process as we consider changes to our noise policy. And that means giving everyone an opportunity to provide input, not just the people that had an interest in doing so historically. So, we can't rely solely on input we received from other projects. Doing that wouldn't ensure that level of inclusivity and transparency. We need to provide everyone an opportunity to provide input on this topic before taking steps to modify our existing policy. Andrew, did you want to add something?
Yeah, if that's okay, Don.
Sure.
I think just to echo you is, this really is, based and influenced certainly in part based on the feedback that we've gotten before, but it's aggregation across multiple feedback avenues into one kind of unified effort focused solely on the noise policy review. That those other efforts have been either tangentially related to a comprehensive reevaluation, or we've been informed on noise concerns on a project specific basis. So I just wanted to echo that. We hear the feedback, we have the feedback, we've incorporated the feedback, and I'm sure many of the folks that have provided feedback will see that reflected in the questions and the content, not only of the Federal Register notice, but the supplemental documentation that's been provided on the website. So thank you, Don.
You're welcome. Thank you. And Andrew, if you don't mind, maybe you can take a shot at this next question coming up. Given comments that I guess FAA has made on the new noise policy and how it would not be retroactive, this commenter says it seems that the overflown communities are disadvantaged because the at-airport communities have a periodic review of their noise contour, or Part 150. Is that correct, that no changes to overflown communities will occur, but at airport communities, they can apply to the new noise policy when their next Part 150 takes place?
Sure. So, Don, this is a good question, and I appreciate the opportunity to clear up some of the confusion here. And first and foremost, I just want to kind of clarify what we mean, or what I believe the questioner means when they're talking about at airport versus overflown communities. And at airport in this context would be those that under the current noise policy fall within the 65 DNL contour. Those are the ones that are currently considered within a non-compatible exposure level in terms of noise, and potentially eligible for mitigation under Part 150 programs currently in effect. Also, they partially meet the criteria for potentially significant impacts associated with development projects, that criteria being a 1.5 dB change within the 65 DNO contour. So those at airport communities is what I think the commenter is referring to, and then overflown communities. We've also used terms like corridor communities, are the communities that are further afield than the 65 DNL, but as shown in the presentation that Don gave again to start the session, are the source of a lot of complaints, primarily associated with potentially maybe a recent implementation of a procedure, or some increase in flights due to economic growth over the last decade prior to the pandemic. And so just to kind of level set, in the past, those further afield in a Part 150 study, what the commenter is referring to as overflown communities, per Part 150 regulations, when we approve proposals that benefit communities outside of the 65, we're actually not allowed to approve those for the purposes of Part 150. The Part 150 regulations clearly stipulate that they have to show a benefit within the 65 over non-compatible land uses. So we could have measures that are considered, and frequently we do, where it would result in an overall noise reduction. However, because that noise reduction is not within the 65, we would have to disapprove those measures for purposes of Part 150. When we do that, though, we do always say that this does not preclude the airport sponsor from pursuing implementation of these measures via other avenues. It just is an indication that for the purposes of Part 150, the current Part 150 regulations and standards, this measure does not meet the requirement. So as we update the noise policy review, and a consideration to change in either metrics or thresholds, or further consideration of levels of compatibility as defined by the the table within Part 150 that identifies compatibility of various land uses at different noise exposure levels. If the noise policy review were to recommend implementation of those, and we as an agency decide to incorporate them, certainly any update going forward would apply those across, regardless of whether or not it was an at airport versus an overflown community. So if there's a new threshold for compatibility, or a threshold for a different metric per se, that would then become the basis for future updates to the Part 150 study, and they would be uniformly applied regardless of the location of the community in question. One thing I do want to stress, though, is that once we update via the noise policy review and these measures go into effect, Part 150 in and of itself is a voluntary process on behalf of airport sponsors. We don't have a means for compelling airport sponsors to update Part 150 programs. Following the update, if there were expanded eligibility, certainly we would encourage our airport sponsors to pursue updates to get access to eligibility for additional mitigation measures. But ultimately, the decision to pursue an update or potentially a new Part 150 for those airport sponsors that don't currently have one rests with the airport sponsors themselves. I do want to suggest that commenters that have feedback on that provide that feedback to the email address or to the docket for consideration via the noise policy review. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, next question. This person says they might have the times of this call confused, and apologies again for that. The question is about their question concerns standards for aircraft use over national parks. Is FAA going to establish standards to protect national park sound values? I think the answer, I can take this one on. Depending on the outcome of this policy review, there are the types of considerations that might come into play down the line related to those sorts of things. At this time, and in the context of the policy review, we're not making any decisions with respect to sound levels or values of national parks, but we're focused on the metrics that might be appropriate for use in certain circumstances or situations. And it's, for example, noise sensitive receivers, which could include national parks, but also schools, hospitals, and homes. That might be a place where we decide a different metric might be appropriate. If your comments being made with respect to specific thresholds and advocating that as a matter of national policy, the FAA should set more protective thresholds when the noise sensitive receiver is a national park as compared to another land use, we would encourage you to make that comment to our docket and explain why, your reasoning, what you think about that specific suggestion. If your comment's being made in the context of a specific national park, it's worth noting that the FAA is working with the National Park Service to develop air tour management plans, which are plans used to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts, if any, of commercial air tour operations on national land cultural resources, the visitor experience, and tribal lands. We encourage you to submit concerns regarding specific parks when the FAA and NPS announce the proposed plans for public comment. Next question. As an indicator of FAA listening to input from the Federal Register notice, what actions has the FAA done related to noise research that was the Federal Register notice 2021 that was asked for? No future research is not valid alone because the FAA has pursued research since 2021. Okay, so I think if we understand this correctly, it certainly is a good question, and we can understand why you might be interested in learning more about how our noise research portfolio was influenced by that input. We considered the comments that we received on the Noise Research Federal Register notice in 2021. As I mentioned earlier, we received over 4,000 comments. We looked at ways that comments related to our existing research portfolio, potential gaps that might need to be filled based on stakeholder feedback, and where we're already going to do work that aligns with the public's views. We regularly consult with our REDAC committee. There's an Environment and Energy subcommittee of REDAC to ensure that this advisory body that issues recommendations on the direction of our research had awareness of the public's input and also provide suggestions on what we should be doing. In another webinar this week, we provided information on how to locate those briefing materials on our website. Adam, do you have anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One thing, just REDAC. I don't know that you defined what REDAC was, but it's a Research and Development Advisory Committee, which oversees the FAA's research, and it helps to advise us on areas that, it's an independent body, made up of broad breadth of people, but they help to inform our research efforts, and looking into various different areas. One of which is on environment and noise and emissions. But talking about looping back to the 2021 Federal Register notice on our research efforts, following the conclusion of that notice and closing and the comments that we received, we consulted with the REDAC on some areas that we should potentially look at expanding our scope of the research of some of our existing programs, and maybe even standing up research of some new programs. So just a couple examples of those to share include some of our adjustments to our ongoing aviation noise and health impacts research, which has been conducted through our Center of Excellence for Alternative Jet Fuels in the Environment, or ASCENT, and various university research partners. But that work originally focused on aviation noise and cardiovascular health impacts, but we've actually been expanding that research now to look at other potential health impacts as well. We're going to be looking at mental health in the future, looking at adiposity or obesity, diabetes. There's a variety of different areas that work's going to expand into, and we're actually going to expand the cohort or groups of studies that we're looking at that are helping to inform that research. So, looking at the comments from that Research Federal Register notice in 2021, there were comments in there about expanding our health impacts research, which is something that that we've taken on. Another way is that we have since that study, and it was just in its infancy at the time when the research notice came out, but we have a comprehensive national sleep study that has started and is ongoing at this time. But there were a lot of comments in that FRN regarding sleep impacts. So that's another area of research that we're taking seriously, and taking based on the comments, making sure that we address gaps in that area. One last area that the comments have informed is considering follow-on analyses to the Neighborhood Environmental Survey, or NES. We are in the process of, as we've talked about throughout the webinar today, looking at additional metrics and thresholds. Now we're looking at potentially using the data from the NES to look at, how other noise metrics may or may not correlate with the national dose response curve that was developed, for DNL, and updating our understanding of community annoyance. So that's another area that these comments have informed in terms of, research and action that we've taken since 2021. And really just want to remind people that this is an opportunity for you to provide input on how our policy should incorporate the latest scientific research, and how it could inform also potential expansion of our noise metric system, the ways we define noise thresholds. So, your input can also influence how and when we use these tools in agency decision making, and how to explain or disclose, expected changes in your noise environment. So, we really hope that you take this opportunity to have your voice heard to heart. And as you weigh how to provide input, we really do encourage you to review the list of the research studies that we've reviewed so far as part of the noise policy review process. And we do list them in our framing paper, which is the foundational elements of the Federal Aviation Administration's Civil Aircraft Noise Policy, the noise measurement system, its component noise metrics and noise thresholds, which is in Appendix A of the framing paper. And that framing paper, as a reminder, is available at our noise policy review web page at www.faa.gov/noise policy review. It's also in the supporting documents tab for the Federal Register notice, which is docket FAA-2023-0855, which can be found on regulations.gov or linked in through the noise policy review webpage that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Adam. Let's see. Next question. Have we studied what thresholds or metrics other countries are applying? I can start with that one. Maybe one of you all would want to finish it up. So I think for this question, I think it's worth noting that we, FAA, participate in the International Civil Aviation Organization's Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, the ICAO CAPE. ICAO is a UN body focused on aviation, and the CAPE is a committee of the ICAO Council focused on addressing aviation environmental issues. We participate in all the working groups, but the ones relevant to this question, I think, would be Working Group 1, which is focused on noise, and Working Group 2, which is focused on airports and operations. We engage with these groups and regularly exchange information and views. Sometimes we exchange data on metrics and thresholds used internationally. We talk about aircraft noise measurements and standards. That's where we set standards internationally for aircraft noise levels, or set limits in measurement procedures. And so I think there's a lot of discussion happening in the international community about these different topics. Does anyone else have anything else they want to add to that one? Ryan?
Yeah, I could jump in here real quick. It is interesting, the aircraft noise is not centric to the US. It's certainly one of those kind of global issues that I think a lot of countries are struggling with. And I think there's some really good ideas out there. There's some very innovative folks out there looking at things very differently. And, the FAA is taking all that information seriously. And part of this process is doing that, is bringing in some of those international studies, those international issues and information, and bringing it into this process. So we did note that there are several metrics that are used internationally, and we noted those in our framing paper, and especially in the earlier webinar Q&A sessions, we had some examples of. There was Australia's use of the PEI, they call it. It's a person event index, and an average individual exposure indicator. These are just a couple of examples. The PEI is kind of an indicator of the total noise load generated by kind of the entire airport. So it's kind of interesting how that concept could be woven into what we're doing today. It's calculated as kind of the sum of the number of the instances where individuals exposed to the aircraft greater than a certain dB. So that's very interesting. And then there's also the PEI, which is usually given as kind of like a single number, and it's used with the AIE, the average individual exposure, to kind of compare the differences. So there's a lot of pretty cool stuff out there, and pretty innovative thoughts that if there are folks out there that want to provide that information or provide a comment on that, that's certainly welcome, because those are the kinds of things that we want to look at. We want to think about this, not just the old way we always have done it, but looking at the innovative new processes that could potentially improve our policy. So that's kind of where we're at today.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, I want to take a second to help orient the folks that have joined us since 3 o'clock on what's going on. You might have noticed we're already going, and I think it's worth taking a second to explain it. Thank you for joining us. This is our 4th Noise Policy Review webinar. My name is Don Scotta, and I manage the Noise Division in FAA's Office of Environment and Energy. As we were preparing for today's webinar, we realized that there was a difference between the times for today's webinar posted in the Federal Register notice and the times on our webpage and other materials. Our Federal Register notice stated that today's webinar was to start an hour ago, 3 o'clock Eastern, and would run until 5 o'clock. However, our webpage and other materials stated that the webinar would run between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern. I'm very sorry about this mistake. In order to rectify it, we've decided to extend today's webinar to be from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern to encompass the extent of both published times. For those of you who have been joining us since 3 o'clock, or that have joined us since we started at 3 o'clock, I want to catch you up on our plan. In a moment, we're going to replay our presentation that was played at 3 o'clock and then switch back to the Q&A, which will continue until 6 o'clock Eastern. If you're interested in hearing the Q&A portion that you might have missed, the entire webinar is going to be recorded and will be available on our website, our webpage at faa.gov/noise policy review shortly. Again, I apologize for the confusion about today's webinar times. It was a mistake, and hopefully you agree that our plan to address it makes sense and provides everyone that planned to join an opportunity to participate. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon. The presentation will begin momentarily. Welcome to our Noise Policy Review webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Don Scotta, and I manage the Noise Division in FAA's Office of Environment and Energy. I will be presenting some information regarding FAA's Noise Policy Review. Following this presentation, we will host a live question and answer session. The entirety of today's webinar will be recorded and posted to FAA's YouTube channel and our Noise Policy Review webpage at faa.gov/noise policy review. Throughout this presentation and during the question and answer session following this presentation, you may submit questions by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. There is no need to wait. You will not be able to see questions asked by others. However, you will see your own questions. If we receive similar questions, we will combine them into one question. You may also submit questions to FAA's YouTube channel if watching live. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during this webinar. Please note, questions and comments made during this webinar will not be recorded to the federal docket. To make an official comment, a link to the Federal Register notice is available at faa.gov/noise policy review. In late 2021, the FAA initiated a review of our noise policy as a part of our ongoing commitment to address aircraft noise. This effort will build on our work to advance the scientific understanding of noise impacts, as well as the development of analytical tools and technologies. It will consider new evidence from the agency's noise research program, including from the Neighborhood Environmental Survey, and the distribution of environmental risks, trade-offs, or externalities across communities. Our goals are to identify and implement well-reasoned, scientifically grounded noise policy updates that incorporate FAA's updated understanding of aviation noise and human response, and the development of analytical tools and technologies to better manage and reduce the environmental impacts of aviation. We also aim to conduct an inclusive, transparent, and participatory process that prioritizes input from substantially affected stakeholders, including local communities. The FAA published our Noise Policy Review Federal Register Notice on Monday, May 1st, 2023. That publication started a 90-day comment period that ends on Monday, July 31st, 2023. The Federal Register Notice includes a brief background on FAA's noise policy and also links to a companion framing paper. The request for comments includes 11 questions. Respondents don't have to answer every question when submitting their response to the docket. The companion framing paper is entitled The Foundational Elements of the Federal Aviation Administration Civil Aviation Noise Policy, the Noise Measurement System, its component noise metrics, and noise thresholds. The framing paper was designed to be read in parallel with the Federal Register Notice. It provides additional context and discussion around the 11 questions included in the notice, and provides context for the review. We wrote it to help aviation stakeholders better understand the questions included in the Federal Register Notice. The scope of this Federal Register Notice is on the foundational elements of FAA's noise policy, metrics and noise thresholds. Regarding metrics, we are taking a hard look at the day-night average sound level and are considering other metrics, such as number above, as well as how each of those metrics are calculated. Regarding noise threshold, in light of Neighborhood Environmental Survey findings and other research, we are considering whether to lower below DNL 65 dBA the definition of the level of significant noise exposure for actions subject to environmental review, and are also considering modifying the definitions of the levels of noise exposure that are deemed normally compatible with airport operations, as set forth in Part 150. The FAA recognizes that aviation noise is a pivotal quality of life issue for some. Aviation noise experiences differ. Communities and individuals have different interests, values, and concerns, and the information about aviation noise that is sought may differ. At the same time, the FAA is developing a policy that will apply to the national airspace system with a large number of stakeholders, those who operate in the system, the traveling public, and those affected on the ground. The interests and concerns of these parties are different, representing different interests, concerns, and priorities. The FAA is committed to ensuring that we provide meaningful, equitable, and transparent access to all stakeholders during this process. The public comment period helps us accomplish that goal. Further, it provides opportunities for us to engage with the public and stakeholders in a consistent way so that FAA understands how we jointly view the noise problem and begin to think about potential solutions or improvements to the way our agency interacts with the public and explains how their experience of aviation noise will change over time as a result of FAA action. Now is the time to provide input, as FAA has not yet made any decisions regarding what, if any, of its noise policy will be updated. Your input will help us understand how we can improve community understanding and expectations regarding future noise exposure, and also how FAA makes decisions regarding the topic. The questions in the Federal Register notice are designed to get input that will supplement our technical expertise and consideration of aviation noise issues. We welcome any comments that our stakeholders are willing to provide and are particularly interested in the public's response to the questions and issues identified in the notice. We are looking for specific recommendations, explanation for any recommended changes, and supporting information or data. Comments addressing potential improvements in how, where, and with whom FAA communicates changes in aircraft noise exposure will be particularly helpful. Please note, comments regarding the level of aviation noise at specific locations should be made on the FAA Noise portal at the link provided. The request for comments provides an opportunity for knowledge and potential solutions to flow from the public to the policymakers at the FAA. Our agency recognizes that those affected by our policies will have views and ideas on them and how they can be improved. We are eager to hear your input and understand your reasoning. The FAA requests your substantive comments. You may ask what that means. A non-substantive comment is one that is not related to the issue under consideration and does not offer data or information that can influence the policy outcome. For example, a noise complaint regarding aviation activity over a specific location is non-substantive and should be directed to the FAA Noise portal. 3 types of comments can provide substantive input for agency decision makers to weigh. First, comments regarding scientific or economic evidence and specialized expert knowledge relevant to the topic at hand are helpful. For example, comments that explain what information is not currently provided by the D&L noise metric that may be disclosed by the application of another noise metric are helpful. So too would a comment that provides information about the economic impact of a different noise threshold, including describing how the conclusion was drawn, what data was relied upon, and what assumptions were made in the analysis. Comments should explain how they are supported by data and why the commenter believes that they are backed up by best available science. Second, comments that point to factual or legal flaws in current or proposed policies, identify gaps between agency policy and legal requirements, or why the policy does not adequately resolve the problem it is intended to address, and discuss the likely unintended consequences of an agency policy. Finally, submissions that provide alternative solutions or enhancements to the rule and explain why these proposals are better suited to resolve the issue than the policy intends to address. This slide presents a collective view on historic and current noise problems. Historically, noise issues were airport-centric, result of infrequent operations and dispersed flight paths, and very loud jet aircraft. Noise concerns were raised primarily by communities immediately adjacent to airports, and communities' lived experience included low cadence of relatively loud aircraft noise events separated by long intervals. Our current noise problem is an airspace or overflight noise problem, resulting from frequent operations, concentrated flight paths, relatively quiet aircraft, and noise concerns raised primarily by corridor communities further from airports. Communities' lived experience includes a high cadence of daily, relatively quiet aircraft noise events separated by short intervals. In addition, there's been an introduction of new entrant and commercial space operations. Now we're going to start unpacking some of the questions in the Federal Register notice. Questions 1 and 2A request information about the aircraft and vehicle types and operations that the policy should address, looking at fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, rockets, future supersonic aircraft, or new entrant technologies like UA, drones, or advanced air mobility aircraft such as air taxi. How and what elements of the operations should be described using noise metrics, and how information should be used by the FAA to communicate with the public regarding changes in noise exposure and to make decisions. Question 2B through E asks things like who is and will be affected by aviation noise in the vicinity of airport versus overflight communities, in the vicinity of commercial space launch or re-entry operations, the vicinity of UAS or other newly emerging technology operations. How has your experience of noise changed over time? How do your interests and concerns differ from others based on your location and experience of aviation operations? How would different noise metrics address these concerns? Congress directed the FAA to establish a single system of measuring noise in the Aviation Safety and Noise Abatement Act of 1979, what we call ASNA. The system must have highly reliable relationship between projected noise exposure and surveyed reactions of individuals to noise, and be applied uniformly in measuring noise at airports and the surrounding area. The single system must account for noise intensity, duration, frequency, and time of occurrence. FAA's noise metric system relies primarily on the day-night average sound level, or DNL. It is a single number metric to quantify cumulative aircraft noise exposure over a 24-hour period, accounting for noise intensity and magnitude, duration of exposure, frequency or number of events, and the time period in which events occur, such as day or night. It's FAA's primary decision metric for actions subject to NEPA and airport noise compatibility planning studies prepared pursuant to 14 CFR Part 150. Question 3 asks about the DNL metric as a whole. What views or comments do you have regarding DNL? About its benefits or shortcomings? Would these views change if another metric was used as a companion, supplement, or alternative to DNL? A companion metric is a noise metric that is used in conjunction with another noise metric, such as DNL, for decision making. A supplemental metric is a noise metric used to improve the public's understanding of the expected change in aviation noise that is not used for decision making. An alternative metric is a noise metric that is used in lieu of another metric, such as DNL, for decision making. Would these views change if FAA changed how DNL is calculated? Question 4 asks about the calculation of DNL and averaging. DNL is calculated using the concept of an average annual day, which averages annual aircraft operations into a single representative day. Do you believe average annual day appropriately describes noise impacts? What other averaging schemes should be considered, and what do they capture that average annual day does not? Question 5 asks about possible decision-making metrics and how they can interact. What noise metrics should be used for decision-making for actions subject to NEPA and airport noise compatibility planning studies prepared pursuant to 14 CFR Part 150? Should different metrics be used in different circumstances? If so, how? Should FAA continue to use DNL for decision-making? How can metrics be used to support better agency decision-making? The FAA is reviewing many metrics that could be considered as a part of that system, including both cumulative metrics, such as the traditional DNL or CNEL, but also other cumulative metrics, such as an 8-hour day, which could be used to evaluate school and work settings. We will also review a range of operational single event metrics, including number above, time above, Lmax, and others that might be suggested. Finally, we are working closely with FAA's Office of Commercial Space to evaluate metrics that are more appropriate for low frequency or impulsive noise, such as commercial space launches. The most appropriate metric could depend on the purpose of the analysis, the audience, and several other factors. Changes to DNL could include changes to adjusting the threshold, averaging technique, and/or changes to its nighttime weighting. DNL with additional supplemental metrics can be used together. Number above, or NA, answers how often will the aircraft level meet or exceed a certain level. Time above, or TA, answers how long will the sound last at or above a certain level. Number above and time above break the DNL metric into its component parts to help explain the noise exposure in a different way. Question 6 asks about communicating changes in noise exposure. FAA's current supplemental noise metric policy is contained in FAA's NEPA policies and procedures, FAA Order 1050.1F. The FAA uses the policy to engage with the public to better explain changes in noise exposure. Supplemental metrics are not used for decision-making. If the FAA were to change this policy, should FAA consider what information FAA communicates regarding changes in noise exposure, where and with whom FAA communicates, what information methods FAA uses to communicate, what venues FAA uses to share information regarding changes in noise exposure? FAA noise thresholds refer to two different levels: FAA significant noise impact threshold for actions being reviewed under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and the Land Use Compatibility Guidelines established in 14 CFR Part 150, Appendix A. Noise thresholds are informed by a historic dose-response curve called the Schultz curve, which provided a useful method for representing the community response to aircraft noise. Both are set at DNL 65 dB. Regarding noise thresholds, question 7 asks, how should historic and neighborhood environmental survey findings be considered in establishing a noise threshold for actions subject to NEPA and land use noise thresholds in 14 CFR Part 150? Should FAA consider other information regarding noise impacts in establishing noise metrics? Should the noise thresholds be established using DNL or another cumulative noise metric? Question 8 asks, should FAA establish noise thresholds using single event or operational metrics for certain types of actions subject to FAA approval or control? When should FAA use these metrics? What should be the level of noise exposure that defines the limits of significant noise exposure in NEPA analyses and for actions subject to 14 CFR Part 150? Question 9 asks about low frequency and impulsive noise events. Should the FAA establish noise thresholds for certain types of actions subject to FAA approval or control, such as when the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation authorizes launch and reentry of commercial space transportation vehicles? What should be the level of noise exposure that defines the limits of significant noise exposure in NEPA analyses and for actions subject to 14 CFR Part 150? Question 11 references the body of scientific and economic literature compiled by the FAA regarding the way aviation noise correlates with annoyance, as well as environmental, economic, and health impacts. It refers the public to Appendix 1, which synthesizes health impacts, such as cardiovascular, sleep, mental health, birth outcomes, and children's learning. Also, it looks at annoyance, noise effects, noise level recommendations, alternative metrics, flight track dispersion, military jet noise, and mental health. It looks at economics and things like health costs and home values, and also summarizes synthesis research. Question 10 asks, what other issues or topics should the FAA consider in this review regarding noise metrics? The method of calculating them, the establishment of noise thresholds, or FAA's method of communicating the change in noise exposure? We ask the public to please explain their response. This noise policy review could have a number of potential outcomes. It could result in FAA updating our regulations, orders, guidance, etc. For example, FAA might revise the threshold of noise-sensitive land use compatibility for 14 CFR Part 150 and/or environmental reviews. It might also provide additional guidance on how to prepare those documents. It could result in different levels of analysis and review for a particular action, such as a change in a flight procedure. and it could result in identifying better ways of communicating with the public about the effects of noise. While this policy review is an important step for the FAA to take, it is critical that we are transparent and clear about the effect any policy changes could have on existing noise exposure. There are some things that will not be affected by any policy changes being considered in this review. Changes in policy alone will not reduce noise exposure. For future environmental reviews, a change in policy could result in different outcomes that may have reduced impacts depending on what alternatives are available and the specific federal action being considered. The proposed policy changes we are talking about here will not change where and when aircraft currently fly. However, as just mentioned, future decisions would take into account the new policy and may result in less impactful outcomes. And finally, policy changes will not require FAA to redo any environmental analyses or decisions that have been made. Future environmental reviews completed after any policy changes were implemented would take into account any changes. For additional information, you can visit our Noise Policy Review webpage at faa.gov/noise policy review. You can also email us for additional information at noisepolicyreview@faa.gov or leave us a voicemail by calling 202-269-6999. Now we're going to shift gears for our Q&A session. Our Q&A session is about to begin. You may submit questions by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. You will not be able to see questions asked by others. However, you will see your own questions. If we receive similar questions, we will combine them into one question. You may also submit questions to FAA's YouTube channel if watching live. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during this webinar. Please note, questions and comments made during this webinar will not be recorded to the federal docket. To make an official comment, a link to the Federal Register notice is available at faa.gov/noise policy review. And now I'd like to introduce today's panelists. As I've already introduced myself, I will start with Adam Schulten. Adam is an environmental protection specialist in the Noise Division of FAA's Office of Environment and Energy. Adam has 13 years of experience working in aviation, 8 of which have been in the environmental field. Adam began his aviation environmental career as a consultant specializing in airport noise before joining the FAA in 2021. As a consultant, Adam conducted noise modeling utilizing FAA tools such as the Aviation Environmental Design Tool and worked extensively to support airports and community roundtables to analyze aircraft flight procedures and provide guidance on the development of alternative procedures that could help to reduce noise exposure. Since joining FAA, Adam has focused on developing methodologies to assist the FAA in assessing noise associated with unmanned aircraft and working with others in the Noise Division to launch the FAA's Noise Policy Review. Andrew Brooks is the Regional Environmental Program Manager for FAA's Eastern Region Airports Division. Andrew has over 24 years of experience working in the environmental field, 21 of which are with the Federal Aviation Administration. He began his career with the Environmental Protection Agency before joining the FAA in 2002 as an environmental protection specialist. He has served as the Eastern Region Environmental Program Manager for Airports Division for the last 11 years, managing complex environmental projects and noise compatibility planning on behalf of the FAA across 7 states in the District of Columbia. Andrew is a national expert on aviation noise and compatibility planning and has been an instructor for the FAA's Noise and Land Use Compatibility Planning course for the past 7 years. Ryan Weller is an environmental protection specialist for the FAA's Western Service Center. He started his FAA career in the Northwest Mountain Technical Operations Division in 2001 and moved to the Western Service Center in 2007. Prior to federal service, Ryan worked in private industry in the chemical and hazardous waste industry. Ryan has managed environmental reviews for regional and local airspace redesign projects, along with military special use airspace projects. Thank you again for participating in this webinar. As we begin the Q&A session, I'd like to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras. We will begin the Q&A momentarily. All right, we are back again. And the first question that I want to get to may have been submitted right before we started the video, and I think it's worth for those folks that joined while the video was playing to provide an update on what's going on, why this webinar is just a little bit different. As we were preparing for today's webinar, we realized that there was a difference between the times for today's webinar in our Federal Register notice and on the webpage and other materials that we've shared about these webinars. Our Federal Register notice stated that today's webinar was to start at 3 o'clock Eastern and would run until 5 o'clock. However, our webpage and other materials stated the webinar would run between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock Eastern. I'm very sorry about that mistake. In order to rectify it, we've decided to extend today's webinar to be from 3 till 6 o'clock Eastern to encompass the extent of both published times. Our plan was, or is, to have played the presentation twice, once at 3 o'clock, and again, it just concluded at 4 o'clock. And we'll switch back now to the question and answer session, which will continue until 6 o'clock Eastern. If you are interested in hearing the question and answer portion that you missed, this entire webinar is being recorded and will be available on faa.gov/noise policy review shortly. We've also been getting a lot of repeat questions from the first hour. So to the extent that we can, we're going to repeat some of those pieces of information so that everyone joining us can hear the answers. Okay, enough about that. Let's move on to our next question. What timeline do you imagine will be between today, when we're doing this sort of Federal Register notice process, and the changes affected by the comments where we're soliciting might actually take effect for future procedures? 2 years, 5 years, 7 years? Adam, do you want to take that one for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, without knowing the number of comments we receive on this FRN, because we could receive many, we could receive not so many, it certainly could push our target time frame to the right, especially if it's on the many side. And our target is to make recommendations within the next year. At that time, we plan to publish a Federal Register notice identifying those recommendations and identifying the agency documents that are going to need to be updated, whether it be regulations, policies, internal orders, other guidance documents that we're going to have to potentially modify. And if rulemaking is necessary to implement the recommendations that come out of the NPR, the rulemaking process certainly does take more time. It generally takes about 36 months, and it can vary widely, though, depending on the nature of the rulemaking, and how extensive it is. So, this timeline could be shortened because we expect the recommendations to identify the major policy and elements of the document that or guidance documents and other reference documents that must be revised. We also have to take into account that the effective date of any policy changes that we make have to provide adequate time for us within FAA to develop any needed tools that are going to be required for implementation. So, for example, if we have to make extensive updates to some of our tools, such as the Aviation Environmental Design Tool, or AEDT, that will play into the timeline for when things might be implemented. We also have to account for interagency coordination within our department and with the Council of Environmental Quality for any changes to our NEPA policies and procedures. We also have to talk with other federal agencies that have an interest or who may be affected as a result of our potential policy or regulatory changes. That'll include the Department of Transportation. I mentioned CEQ and other agencies as well, because it's going to be needed for, the policy could influence a lot of other areas within the federal government. But, we are committed to this project, and we will work as quickly as possible to effectuate any recommendations, develop the tools that are necessary, also train the staff as appropriate so that the policies can be implemented effectively.
Thanks, Adam. Andrew, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I just want to follow on, as Adam said, it's kind of dependent upon the recommendations, and, certain measures could potentially be implemented earlier than others. But I think, as we acknowledged in response to some of the previous webinars, that even if it does take some time to get the policies in place, we can start working to assess some of the recommendations of NPR within studies that are ongoing, so that once those policies go into effect, it's not then an additional lag time, and that we're waiting for additional, say a period of time post rulemaking before results from studies start coming out. We have a way that we could probably phase in some of the analytical considerations that are being contemplated by the noise policy review at an earlier basis. So just wanted to kind of remind everybody that we did discuss that on a previous webinar. So thank you, Don.
Thank you, Andrew. Just a quick announcement. We first thank you all for being here, and we appreciate your ongoing participation in our webinars and in this noise policy review. I want to acknowledge that we're receiving questions from many participants, and that some of those questions we're receiving were asked and answered in prior sessions. You've heard us reference those already. While we certainly hope to be able to get to every question from every participant, I want to emphasize that we're prioritizing the time we have by answering new questions from new participants. If we have extra time at the end, we'll gladly go back and repeat questions and answer them again if time permits. But we want to focus on sort of new questions from new participants, because anyone's free to go back and watch where we've addressed those in prior webinars. Thanks again for being with us today. Okay, next question here. Adam, maybe you can take this one on for us again. I understand that DNL does not measure a range of noise. Could you please talk about low frequency noise and vibration and its potential cell and tissue damage?
Sure, I can talk to that. There's a lot of elements to that as well. So, but kind of step through that. And really, I guess starting off with in 2002, the Federal Interagency Committee on Aviation Noise, or FAA, which we've referenced earlier in the webinar, but that was in the earlier session, so folks may not have been familiar with them. But FAA is a member of that group, and they enlisted an expert panel to report and look at issues of low frequency noise based on work it had completed for the Minneapolis Metropolitan Airport Commission, and specifically the city of Richfield, Minnesota. And the results of that was the expert panel consensus findings described that residents experiencing rattle-related annoyance due to low-frequency operations, but did not identify any known risks of adverse public health effects or risks of structural damage. And following that, FICAN published several major responses to the panel's findings. And ultimately, FICAN agreed with the expert panel's findings and provided some additional context for its positions. Few examples of that is that low frequency aircraft noise from civil aircraft poses no known risk of adverse public health effects, nor risk of structural damage, or does its presence necessarily increase annoyance. Also, that areas experiencing high levels of low frequency noise can't be identified effectively using the day-night average sound level, or DNL, which does not account for the low frequencies. However, there is no other existing measure out there of low frequency noise that is effective at predicting noise-induced rattle, and that it's really is premature to adopt a low frequency noise metric or impact criterion without doing additional research to address the interaction of building construction or contributions of loudness and rattle to annoyance. The FICAN findings can be found online. I'm not going to read the web link because it's kind of large, so I just ask one of our panelists to provide, or not panelists, but someone to provide a link to that in the chat potentially, just so folks can find it. And really, I'd like to emphasize that FICAN concurred with the experts panel's findings, and when concurring with the panel, FICAN noted that the panel's conclusions were consistent with the federal research conducted on supersonic aircraft and supersonic transport, which produces much higher levels of low frequency noise than those produced by civil aircraft operations at most of the 19,000 airports in the NAS. So thinking about, supersonic aircraft like the Concorde that used to be flying. And in a subsequent investigation of low frequency noise that was conducted under the FAA's Partnership for Air Transportation Noise and Emissions Reduction, researchers found that sources of low frequency noise, including induced start of takeoff roll, acceleration down the runway, and reverse thrust on landing, and that any new predictive measure of annoyance from vibration and rattle should account for lower frequencies, I should say, than those in A-weighted sound levels. Additional information on low frequency noise studies in airports can be found on our Ascent website, which is https /ascent.aero/partner-1. Again, I'd ask someone to post that in the chat too, so folks on the webinar can find that. But the data is and the studies is available there. And just really want to finish by saying, structural vibrations resulting in the rattling of windows and items in some homes near airports or space vehicle launch sites are caused by low frequency noise. And although we've investigated the phenomenon, we don't have any regulations, guidelines, or obligations for measuring low frequency noise or mitigating the damage for it, to homes or otherwise due to vibrations from passing aircraft or commercial space transportation activity.
Thank you, Adam. That's a great answer. Next question. What ways are you considering changing methods you are considering using to regulate commercial spaceflight noise in comparison to the methods currently in place for commercial aviation? I can take that one. So we're considering whether the current human annoyance thresholds for aviation activities are appropriate for commercial space operations, or if they're not. In addition, we're looking at what metrics are appropriate to assess community noise impacts of commercial space operations. We're seeking interests or concerns from communities in the vicinity of these facilities where commercial space operations occur to inform the use of noise metrics and thresholds used currently or that we should be using. Specifically, we're seeking input on what noise metrics and thresholds would assess those concerns, and we welcome input to be submitted to the docket. So thank you for that question. Andrew, next one maybe can go to you. Some FAA panelists, actually I think you were one of them, have said that they experienced noise from concentrated next-gen flight paths. This person asks, what are their DNLs? Do they know these or did they have to look them up? How can the public make appropriate recommendations for thresholds for DNL or number above if they don't have this information?
Thank you, Don. So I'll address the last part of that question. Really, how can you get information on the DNL that you live in? And the appropriate means is to familiarize yourself with the analyses that are happening at your local airports. If it's a environmental review subject to the National Environmental Policy Act, and there are contours generated via that method. If there's a Part 150 study undertaken, if there's a procedure change underway, all of these will have some sort of noise analysis component to them. Larger airports, such as what we call the large hubs, your airports like SFO, Denver, Seattle, Miami, Kennedy, and those kind of large commercial service airports typically have a noise office that individuals that live near the airport can contact. Those noise offices may have a lot of information about their current contours and where the individual that is concerned resides within. So a lot of times when these studies are occurred, proposed actions are notified. An airport undertakes a Part 150 study. They do engage with local communities. I know many of the folks on the call here are engaged in, either initiatives such as, their local version of a Quiet Skies initiative or some sort of aviation roundtable. I don't know all of the various organizations nationwide, but I know that many airports have stand-ins for those kinds of organizations. And share information with those folks. Folks engaged in those resources, in those organizations may have access to resources as well. Many of the larger airports use flight tracking systems. You can go online. Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has an online information system where you can actually see the contours that they generated via their Part 150 study. They're overlaid over a map. You can put your address in, see where you are with respect to those contours. You can do 15-minute delayed flight tracking to see the information about the flight that's arriving or departing over you at a given time. Oftentimes they have noise monitor reports from their noise monitor systems. Again, somewhat delayed, but essentially live streamed. I believe San Francisco is another one that I'm familiar with that has that type of system where you can go to their website and get that information for yourself. Thank you, Don.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just
Brian, did you want to add something? Go for it.
well, I was just going to jump in here a little bit just to kind of give a little different perspective, because I know the airport noise offices are a really good resource, and I know that I've gone on those myself and looked at what kind of data that they're providing, and a lot of them, for the FAA, it's really kind of based upon project centric type of things. So when we have a project like we are changing something on the runway, Andrew's group would be doing some kind of noise analysis. If I'm doing a project in the airspace, we look at the change that's happening. But the airport noise office is kind of always, a lot of them do on a monthly basis or quarterly basis. They provide reports on the noise that is out there all the time, meaning not specifically related to a project. And so I found that those have been helpful for some community members to go in and say, okay, here's some data that's not being provided elsewhere, and it's been helpful for a lot of the folks that are fairly close to the airport. And I know I've heard the kind of the complaint that there's not a lot of data once you get farther away from the airport. And I know a lot of the roundtables are related to airport type of communities. And I think we talked about the overflight communities at the beginning of this. And if that's of concern to folks listening today or listening on the YouTube channel later on, those are the kind of comments that we'd really like to hear about. If there's some gaps in the current policy that you feel like you aren't getting the information, or it's not being presented in the right way, or you feel like there's another a way to do it that's more effective, those are the kind of comments that we'd really like to encourage folks from the community or wherever to submit those, because that's the type of information that would be really helpful for us moving forward, saying, okay, there's a gap here, or there's an area for improvement. This is where we should hone in on. So thanks, Don.
You bet. Thanks for adding to that, Brian. Let's see, Adam, maybe you can take this next one here. Is an alternative metric defined as one that is used for decision making, whether or not DNL is a metric used by the FAA for decision making?
Yeah, this is a good question, and glad it was asked, because I think it can be confusing to folks when we're talking about the different types of metrics and whether a metric is an alternative metric or a companion metric or a supplemental metric. So in the context of this policy review, we're referring to an alternative metric is being a noise metric other than DNL that serves as the primary decision-making metric for a particular situation. So basically, a replacement for DNL potentially in a particular situation, although we may continue to use DNL in some situations for a primary metric. It really all depends on the outcome of this policy review and what feedback we get. Then, we have the concept of a companion metric where you could have a metric such as DNL and another metric, or, two or some combination of metrics that are used together to be used as a decision-making mechanism. So basically you could have two metrics that work in tandem together where, either or you trigger one or the other one, or you trigger both of them potentially, and that would be, the guidance that the agency would use for decision-making purposes. Now, what those metrics are depends. Again, I said it could be DNL plus something else, or it could just be two completely different metrics from DNL. And then, so those are companion metrics. And then we've been talking about supplemental metrics, which is where you have a primary decision-making metric, which could be DNL. And then you have another metric that's used with it, but that other metric is just there for transparency and disclosure purposes to help paint a better picture of the noise exposure or explain it in a different way than, that other metric or that primary decision-making metric is explaining it. So not to, as an example, you could maybe use DNL as your decision-making metric, but then maybe use a metric like number or time above, for example, to help paint a better picture of the noise exposure in a different way that the DNL isn't speaking to, but you wouldn't use that metric to make, or for the agency wouldn't use that metric to make a decision. So that is one area of metrics that can be a little confusing, and I hope my answer clarified that. And that is something, that we're definitely looking for feedback from the public, as part of this policy review, is if people have an idea of ways that the metrics could work together or not. And, if metrics should complement one another or supplement, or, we should be looking at replacing DNL for, certain situations. As we discussed at the beginning of the webinar, we'd really appreciate feedback on that, and have folks, make a comment to the docket, explaining what their thoughts are.
Thanks, Adam. I think I'm going to take the next one myself. Can a change in the FAA noise policy include not publishing the DNL 65 slide showing historical trends in noise exposure and enplanements, and instead publish the DNL 46 NES curve version, especially given the last 10 years pre-COVID shows a 39% increase per a recent UC Davis Aviation Noise and Emissions Symposium conference presentation? I'm taking this one because I recall having a similar conversation with someone I'm going to guess is on this call at that conference. So I think, certainly we welcome you all to submit any sorts of comments you'd like to our docket. And this is absolutely something that could be suggested that way. I think, what I'm seeing here, I think the root of the question is the window of time in which we're looking at and talking about trends and reductions. We've been presenting both the historic Schultz curve and our new national curve in all presentations related to the policy review. But I think, if the suggestion is that we should be using a different window or a different way of showing how we're looking at trends, I think that is a reasonable suggestion. It's a reasonable thing for you to submit as a comment in the docket. Andrew, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think we have a couple of different interpretations on this one.
Sure.
That I think we're trying to kind of just ensure that we're getting the crux of the response here. And the way I'm understanding it is that they're asking that the trend comparison showing the reduction in exposure of population of 65 DNL from mid 70s being 7 million going down in comparison to the increase in aircraft operations going up, if that curve can be replaced with the 46 DNL. And I just am not certain that the data is available, but that's certainly, as Don said, something that we would need to consider and look at via a clarification of this comment in submittal. So I just wanted to mention that, for us, we have a couple of different interpretations on this, so it would be helpful if you, if in submitting this, if you could clarify exactly your intention and help us address it appropriately, incorporate it appropriately. So thank you, Don.
That's a good point about data availability. Adam, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that as well, because traditionally we've looked back to the mid 70s, and data availability, the further back you go, especially that far back, is probably going to be limited, in terms of looking at operations comparisons, and even, in terms of being able to go beyond the DNL 65, the quality of the modeling data available at that time might not be so great. So just want to caution that, we certainly can look at doing additional trend analysis going back that far, and looking at operations versus the, various DNL levels, but we may be limited by the data that's available at that time, just because, back in those periods, there wasn't even computer modeling for doing noise studies and that sort of thing. So, just have to caveat, whatever is presented, the further back in time you go, the less accurate your numbers may potentially be, but we have to do some investigation to see what's there.
Thank you both. Okay, next question. I'll take this one too, actually. So the question is, what sort of changes can the public expect following the noise policy review? And it's a good question. I think it's one we received in our other webinars in one way or another. So I want to take a second to explain that, basically it's too early to answer this question with any certainty. And the reason is we haven't made any decisions about what we intend or what we could change in the noise policy and how those changes might be implemented if we make them. I think if you've seen one of our webinars before, you've heard me say that changes in our noise thresholds, it's not the same thing as turning the volume down on a radio. So changes in our policy don't in itself reduce noise. Completing the noise policy review isn't going to make aircraft quieter or change where they fly or reduce demand for commercial passenger and cargo flights. Only quieter aircraft, reduction in flight operations, or both can reduce noise, and the noise policy review isn't going to change those considerations. We as the FAA can't limit the number of flights within airspace, but what we can, what this policy review can do, and we've talked about this a little bit, and I think I presented it in the slide, is it can change the context in which we look at federal actions, which could result in different outcomes for future decisions. And that's where the potential benefit lies in us making a change to our policy, and why it's important that we get your input so that future decisions are made in light of the new policy. Next question. Or Ryan, did you want to add something?
Well, I was just going to say, as far as the, I know we have got that question quite a few times. It's like, why aren't we going back, or why is this policy not going to be retroactively? But the issue here is it's the policy, it's the kind of the rules about how we look at changes to the NAS, and the NAS is the National Airspace. But it's really how we look at those changes, and those thresholds and the metrics we use actually could change the outcome. And I think, Don, you just mentioned that's kind of an important part of this process. We're saying it's not going to prevent projects from happening, but it actually could change the outcome of, let's say, a potential flight track change. That if the policy today says it's not a significant noise impact, but then if the policy does change to make that become let's say, a significant noise impact, then that would have to be looked at very differently, and that could change the decision that the agency does in implementing that procedure or not implementing that procedure. Or it may trigger it to a higher level of environmental review that could potentially again change the decision. So even though the policy doesn't, like you mentioned, turning down the volume, it could potentially change how projects are managed in the future. And when I say projects, I'm talking about changes to the NAS, be it air traffic changes or airport changes. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Andrew, did you want to add something too?
Yeah, Don, I appreciate that. Ryan mentioned the questions that we're getting, and we've been getting consistently since the first webinar last Tuesday on retroactive application of the policy. And, I just wanted to jump in there, is that the standard for decision making is based on the policy in effect at the time that the decision is in front of you. And the degree to which we can be informed based on future policy updates, we certainly do consider. At this time, we're just initiating this policy review, and we don't know at this point what the outcome will be. Certainly the trend in recent years has been, in recognition of this, further disclosure and communication and engagement, especially with regard to air traffic actions. I can speak personally. Over the last decade, Air Traffic Organization has done a substantial amount in terms of addressing the complaints with regard to engagement, and has really taken that to heart and gone out to communities to have conversations and inform them on actions that are pending. Certainly, there's still work to do for my organization as well in airports and all the organizations within the FAA on that regard. But the standard is to make the decision based on the policy in effect at the current time. For example, within the last 6 months, we have on wetlands gone back and forth on what is considered a wetland. And just today, the Supreme Court changed the ruling about what would be considered a water of the United States under the Clean Water Act. So for the previous 6 months, when we were under the 2015 rules, we would have been based on those rules. Now, moving forward, we're going to have to evaluate the Supreme Court decision and make the rules appropriate. It's the same for each resource that we consider. And as the noise policy evolves, we will make the decision based on the policy that's in place at the time that's appropriate. But certainly, as we've all indicated, there's a commitment to additional communication. Another commitment and another growth area that I've seen is the use of supplemental metrics to better inform not only the public, but the decision makers on metrics above and beyond the use of DNL alone. And certainly we recognize that there are other areas, as we've talked about previously, commercial space and unmanned aerial vehicles and advanced air mobility, where we recognize that there's going to need to be some flexibility in terms of the policy moving forward. So as the environment evolves, we will adjust accordingly, but we will make decisions based on the standards that are in place and the policies that are in place at the time that the action is in front of the agency. It's not just the FAA's standard, it is the federal government standard, regardless of the agency. So I just wanted to clarify that because Ryan had brought it up, and I know we're getting some questions on it as well tonight, Don. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Andrew. I think our next question is sort of sticking with the same theme, and maybe I'll kick it to Adam first, but Ryan and Andrew are welcome to dig in once Adam's finished. The question is, the decision to lower the threshold for significant noise concerns below DNL 65 dBA demonstrates that the FAA is not truly interested in the widely voiced concerns about how the Metroplex plan is adversely impacting communities. If the FAA was authentically concerned about human impact, they would not be changing the standard to a more lenient metric. I guess there really wasn't a question there, but it's more of a comment. Adam, would you mind addressing that?
Yeah, sure. And the first thing I'd just like to address is that it kind of appears a little bit to misunderstand the effect that a lower significance threshold would have. And, I'd like to address that first, because if you actually lower the threshold, you could actually potentially identify more individuals as being affected by noise rather than decreasing the number. Also same thing with a metric, depending on which metric you use, you may also do the same thing. We're not, I think that the comment that we're changing to a more lenient metric or threshold may be a little bit misaligned, just because we're looking at potentially lowering, thresholds and looking at other metrics, which again, could actually identify more individuals as being affected rather than decreasing the number. But just want to really remind folks that lowering the NEPA significance threshold for, our land use compatibility guidelines and noise sensitive land use areas is not actually going to lower the noise experience in those communities. It's, as Don has mentioned earlier in the webinar, it's, not going to turn the volume down on the radio necessarily. It's not going to change the current noise exposure at these areas. The factors that control noise impacts around the U.S. really are the aerodynamics of the specific aircraft and vehicles that are being flown, the total number of operations, by these aircraft and the vehicles over those locations. And neither of these factors are being affected, by this policy review. Also, the NEPA significance threshold is a tool that the FAA uses to disclose information on the effects of proposals for FAA actions or approvals that may impact the noise environment. And any potential change to our NEPA significance thresholds is not automatically going to lower noise impacts around the U.S. or, if we use different metrics. However, it may assist the FAA with disclosing potential impacts, and it may assist us in our decision-making process. And as part of that, as Ryan mentioned, and I think his last response is that it may increase the level of environmental review that we conduct for certain projects, and it may cause the agency to arrive at a different decision, based on what those thresholds and metrics are. So it may result in a different outcome. So one example is that thinking about additional environmental reviews, something that may currently qualify for a categorical exclusion or CADEX as it's called, may require the FAA to prepare a more robust environmental document, such as an environmental assessment, or even an environmental impact statement, and we may have to prepare more of those. And depending on the outcomes of those documents and the alternatives that are available, it could end up resulting in different agency decisions for projects moving forward. So I think it's a great question, and glad got the chance to clarify a little bit what actually, the effect of changing a metric or lowering a threshold, potentially what that could actually mean.
Thanks, Adam. I see both Ryan and Andrew want to weigh in. Ryan, why don't you go first, and then Andrew, you can follow up.
Okay, I'll be quick. So yeah, I just want to kind of chime in here about that, because I can envision that folks out there are probably trying to figure out, okay, so that means you're going to do a lot more studies, and what does that mean for me as the individual out there? Well, I think a couple things is, with the more studies, you get more information, and with the more information, I think that's a better process for people to understand what the changes are. And let's say we didn't even want to touch the DNL, which is if we called it the alternative metric, and we just decided to add some companion metrics to it. That wouldn't necessarily mean that we would have more analysis, or I'm sorry, different analysis like a CADX or an EA, but you may get more information, or there may be more requirements that are put into the policy to disclose those impacts to a wider group of people. So those are some of the possibilities I could see, or even adding supplemental noise metrics. I think we've all touched upon the supplemental as not so much as a decision metric, but as a disclosure or information metric, and I think that lends itself to some of these communities that are farther out, that aren't right by the airport, but that are in the overflight areas. And I think some of that information could potentially be helpful for those communities to understand what the impacts are going to be, as opposed to today where we're using kind of a one metric, one type of tool.
Thanks, Ryan. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to continue on with what Ryan was saying, and having a more informed populace is certainly helpful. I think one of the common critiques that we had heard through certainly in my early years in the agency, going back over 20 years now, is general lack of awareness or general lack of information available, or when something happens, not being able to have data to cite to understand exactly what the change is. And so in part, the noise policy review is hoping to address, those kind of continual concerns that we've had. And, I go back not 20 years, not to say that those concerns were only raised 20 years ago, but that, they've been ever present. And, we've tried to approach that previously, as I said, by, committing to more, public engagement, public outreach, publication of documentation, and so on and so forth. And still those concerns are present. So certainly one way to address those types of concerns is, as Ryan indicated, is have a more informational suite of data that folks can pull from. And one other aspect of this, to tie back to what Adam was saying about changing the metrics and changing the significance levels, again, it's not to exclude individuals and make it a more limited pool of potentially affected individuals, but it's actually to make it a broader pool. And by making it a broader pool, it actually opens up additional opportunities for folks to potentially get access to mitigation measures that currently do benefit communities that are significantly impacted or that are in non-compatible areas. So should the significance threshold change, should the compatibility threshold change, certainly that would have to play into how we would approach supporting mitigation efforts in response to federal actions before us, either procedure changes or airport development actions, commercial space actions, new entrants, or in terms of how we would consider compatibility and eligible measures within a Part 150 study, should an airport update their Part 150 study in the new paradigm following the issuance of the NPR. Certainly folks in those areas would, I presume, be interested in getting access to those mitigation measures to help alleviate the exposure that they're currently experiencing. So thank you, Don.
Thank you all for weighing in on that question. Next up, I'll take this one. So this is a question that we've seen several times at our different webinars and haven't really had a chance to get to it until today. So whoever's submitting it, thank you for your continued engagement and for submitting the question again. The question is, the input to the Federal Register notice in 2021, that's our Noise Research Federal Register notice, Said the given the number 2 input from that notice was for FAA to do a National Academy of Sciences consensus report on health effects. Why has FAA not done that since it was related to research? Before addressing the substance of the question, I think it's important to clarify that the suggestion really wasn't the second most commonly tagged item. It wasn't in the top 5. It was the second most commonly tagged item within a subcategory of comments related to additional research topics. But there were other more highly tagged comments in general that we received. But digging into the substance, as we noted in our presentation during the webinar, public comment is not about majoritarian rule. If that was the case, form letter campaigns would have much more success than they do. Rather, the goal of the public comment period is to provide well-reasoned, evidence-based comments that are much more effective at influencing policy outcomes. That said, with respect to the specific suggestion of a consensus report, we really haven't made any decisions on it yet regarding that input. Our current thinking is that such a consensus report shouldn't be considered until after we complete our research on cardiovascular disease and the National Sleep Study. So we're a couple of years away from that being ripe for consideration. Next question, Ryan, maybe you can take this one. For the noise policy review, looking at metrics and thresholds, what will FAA do to make a balanced and independent analysis that is unbiased beyond making comments publicly available?
Okay, yeah, I think we've heard something, some of the comments in regards to this in the past webinars, and it was really kind of related to, are we biased towards certain stakeholders, or is there, do some groups have more weight than others in making decisions? And I just kind of want to circle back to the kind of the fundamentals of our environmental review policy. I know we're talking about noise. This is noise policy, but as far as the review of actions or projects or changes to the NAS, this is where our order kind of kicks in, and whenever we're considering those potential environmental impacts of a project's decision, our policy is really based upon the FAA Order of 1050. And it provides us the guidance and the regulations that require the FAA to do really an objective analysis of all the impacts, including noise. There's a whole long list of different impact categories, noise being one of them. Environmental justice is another. I know we talked about that a few hours ago. Historical properties, national parks, air quality. There's a whole list of different categories that are required of us to analyze. And so those are things that we kind of have to do. There's not really this option to say, well, we aren't going to do it or whatever. But these reviews, they're used by the decision makers in the FAA to really make the best choice with that action, and they're not really biased upon any particular stakeholder or group. It's really based upon our orders and our requirements that we have to do.
Thanks, Ryan. Andrew, this sort of reminds me of a comment or a question I think that I saw come through about oversight of our consultants when doing environmental reviews and how we maintain independence and eliminate bias. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So Ryan discussed the approach for the FAA on how we handle environmental review, and airports, unlike the program that Ryan works in air traffic, we have a more of a third-party relationship when it comes to environmental reviews, because airports is primarily a funding issuance program wherein we oversee the administration of several means of providing federal grant and aid support to development projects nationwide. And as part of that, in order to get access to the federal funding, airport sponsors have to meet the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act. Those analyses that they do are in and of themselves actually eligible for federal funding. So the airport sponsor will retain consultants, will direct consultants, and develop analyses to submit to us. But all of that has to happen under airports oversight. And in fact, prior to 2020, we would be working on document reviews and providing comments, feedback, indicating, critical issues, technical issues, legal issues with the analyses, and we would have to accept the document as final before we would issue a decision on it. So we still have oversight over the program, but in 2020, the Council on Environmental Quality upgraded the regulations to clarify the regulations governing the National Environmental Policy Act and its implementation to clarify that the federal agency has to have the development of NEPA documents has to happen under the supervision of the federal agency. So the federal agency really has much more direct control, and Airports program has been using that update that happened under the Trump administration to really get in, have more emphasis on scope of analyses, identify issues, develop schedules for analyses, insist on additional public engagement opportunities, and so forth. So for airports, we have a direct control over that in accordance with the CQ regs. But one thing I did also want to touch on, Don, is as Ryan and I have touched on this question at previous webinars, is I've seen follow-on questions come in indicating that the question is really geared more towards ensuring no undue influence over the decisions associated with the noise policy review. So if I can take a moment to just talk about that in that context as well. And again, this entire process is open to all stakeholders. So our stakeholders certainly are the public, aviation users, anyone that has an interest in the issue. We're inviting comment on. I've been engaged in this process since the start, as many of the other folks on the panel. We are opening our discussion out to everyone simultaneously. We have not had any separate conversations with industry, aviation users, anything like that, above and beyond these kinds of conversations that we're having here with you folks now. And certainly, we understand the perspectives of various other non-public stakeholders, if you will, but certainly they would not have any influence over the decisions moving forward. Again, the goal here is to get a more robust, more informative, better noise policy for decision making, and the agency is the one that has the final authority over all of the users as well. We would not abrogate our responsibility for the safety of the NAS to any individual user. And I just, all I can do is provide a commitment in that regard to, I guess, ascertain that there is no undue influence being exerted by any parties over this process, and that certainly any feedback we get from industry via the docket and the website will be made publicly available as well. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Andrew. Just want to take a second to make a note to folks. We're getting a variety of questions that are unrelated to the noise policy review. In deference to those who are attending our webinars with an interest in the policy review, we're filtering out questions that aren't relevant. As a reminder, you can submit noise complaints to the FAA at our noise portal at https://noise.faa.gov, where a location-specific noise complaint can be up-leveled to address a generalized concern regarding noise metrics or thresholds or anything that we can see is related to the noise policy review. We may modify the question or respond to part of the comment or question that is relevant to the NPR. And also, we're seeing a number of repeat questions or similarly worded questions. So we're doing what we can to combine them into one question as we get through them. Okay, next question. Maybe Adam, you can take the lead on this one. A number of commenters are concerned by sleep disruption caused by aircraft operating at night and early in the morning. Could a new metric better penalize or isolate nighttime single event noise impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely, using different metrics can speak to different things. So just looking at our current metric, which is the day-night average sound level, or DNL, that weighs the cumulative noise exposure over a 24-hour period and does include in it a weighting or a penalty, so to speak, for aviation activity that occurs during the nighttime hours. which is defined as from 10 p.m. Until 7 a.m. The next morning. And it weighs it differently than daytime activity. So, daytime activity and operation is just counted, one operation is just counted as it is, but during that 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. period, every operation that occurs during that period is given a 10 times weighting, or is multiplied by a factor of 10. So one operation during that nighttime period from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. is actually counted as 10, or is equivalent to 10 daytime operations. So although the DNL metric does weigh nighttime operations differently than daytime, and does account for that increased sensitivity to nighttime noise, it is possible that we will consider different weighting, and whether, the weighting in DNL is adjusted, or maybe we do weighting of different metrics accordingly. But really, we're waiting for our sleep research, to mature more in that sleep study that I referenced in answer to an earlier question. That may inform our decision to change that nighttime weighting.
Thanks, Adam. Andrew, did you want to add something?
Yeah, one of the common metrics that we use to kind of focus in on certain periods of time throughout the day in lieu of DNL is known as LEQ, or noise level equivalent. And we can set that at a range of time. Typically, you'll see an LEQ 1 hour, an LEQ 8 hour as a measure of analysis. And what it's been found to correlate well to is actually speech interference and sleep disturbance. So, for example, commenters making a recommendation on, school or educational interference, we would interpret that as, a concern with speech interference, and see that as a request for an LEQ tailored to school hours. And one goal, hopefully, through the noise policy effort, is to have kind of some sort of flexibility to adjust specific to a given educational facility and the range of hours that it's operational, to really inform from a speech disturbance perspective, or even for a sleep disturbance perspective, say, a 10-hour period, an 8-hour period, or whatever corresponding to the DNL component, where it's penalized, and just inform what the noise exposure is during those hours to kind of give a correlation to sleep disturbance. So thank you, Don.
Thank you, Andrew. Adam, did you want to add something again, or?
Yeah, just on that front too, in addition to an equivalent sound level, or LEQ, that also, we could also look at another option or potential areas, just using a different period we talked a lot about like number above or time above, for example. And that's another way could look at this, is looking at those different time periods, but with a different type of metric as well. One that more counts the events or the time above a specific threshold, which number of time above would. We could look at, that's one potential area that that's if it's of interest, we could consider, is looking at that during nighttime versus daytime hours as well. So just wanted to add on another example potentially of how things could be looked at with regard to nighttime operations. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, next question. I think I can take this one. It is a standard communication that the FAA has not made decisions and is seeking input. This is most prevalent in the NEPA process and the eventual outcome of a FONSI, or finding of no significant impact. How can we feel more comfortable that the FAA is truly considering the input? Having another comment period is particularly helpful, but not necessarily proof of considering the input. This is a great question. There's probably nothing I can say beyond what we've already said to convince you that we haven't made decisions yet, and that we really do want to have input from our stakeholders. But I want to address it, the sort of consideration head on. When we started this project, our former administrator, Administrator Dixon, identified transparency and credibility as some of the principles to which we're going to aspire in carrying out this project, this noise policy review. And we think we've identified a path forward that addresses your interest in understanding how feedback was considered or will be considered. In this next step section of our request for comments, the Federal Register notice, we commit ourselves to a series of actions following the close of the comment period that we believe address it at its core. The Federal Register notice will address by publishing another Federal Register notice that will address what feedback we receive, how we considered it, and how it informed our thinking in developing any recommendations. The next notice will also identify how those potential next recommendations we develop will be implemented, and by which part of the FAA, which office will be doing that implementation, and the process that will be used to issue the sort of revised document. If we're making a change to an order or a regulation, we'll outline the process that's going to be followed for implementing those changes. Okay, next question here. Adam, maybe you can take this one on. The commenter mentions that, you know, they're talking about disruptions in their work now that folks are working more from home, and they say that they're having a hard time concentrating while working at home, but also feel like there's, you know, consistent noise after the work hours and things like that, and they don't get a break. Do you have anything you can comment on that?
Sure. I think this is a really good comment and is really the type of feedback that would be helpful to submit as a comment to the docket and to the Federal Register notice, because it really does speak to some potential metrics that could equate with these experiences, you know, in these time periods that are discussed. You know, it also starts to paint a picture for our technical experts about the values and priorities that you know, communities are placing, you know, that are affected by aircraft noise and what things they value. You know, so just thinking about this comment and some of the potential metrics maybe that would speak to these issues that could help better communicate around noise exposure from aircraft is, you know, a metric such as an equivalent sound level, for example, and as Andrew had kind of talked about in the last response, and I also did as well. You know, you could use it for a certain period of time, such as an 8 or 9 hour day, which, you know, would be representative of typical work hours to help quantify the aircraft noise exposure that's being experienced during those times. Similarly, you could look at number above, you know, during those different time periods, which could also help to speak to disruption in a different way than LEQ or an equivalent sound level. You know, and we could also look at different time periods versus weekdays versus weekends. So, you know, providing a comment like this to the docket, although it doesn't necessarily call out a specific metric, you know, that is being suggested, you know, it helps talk to our technical experts on what aspects of communicating around noise would be helpful and assessing aircraft noise that's most important to our stakeholders and communities, and helps us, you know, kind of link or map a metric or a threshold that might best correspond to these lived experiences. So again, you know, providing a comment like this is really helpful. And, you know, we fully expect that not everyone's a noise expert. Not everyone's going to know what metric or thresholds maybe speak to what their lived experiences are. But, you know, even providing a comment like this, just speaking to, you know, the things that you value and the things that you want to have communicated about noise exposure, you know, even though it doesn't point to a specific metric or threshold, it's still helpful as part of this, you know, noise policy review, and really would invite folks to provide comments to the docket, you know, even along these lines, because it's helpful for our technical experts to help, you know, identify what potential metrics or thresholds maybe would work, even if the commenter doesn't necessarily know, you know, which one would speak to that the best.
Thank you, Adam. Andrew, maybe you can take on lead on the next one. This question asking about whether environmental, I think we received something similar to this before, whether our environmental analyses considered airport density within a specific geographic area, and the interaction between small airports and the aircraft that fly between them. Are there any policies that we have that might limit the number of airports or operations within a specific area?
Thanks, Don. This is a question we get quite frequently. And I want to say environmental analyses conducted by the FAA consider density of small airports to the degree that they're relevant to the project at hand. So should a project at a given airport require a change to an operation at another airport in close proximity in order to be successful, then certainly the analysis would consider all changes at both airports. For example, we've had several projects in the area that I work most frequently in is New York City. And so LaGuardia, JFK, Newark, and Teterboro, which is the primary GA reliever for New York City and one of, if not the largest general aviation airports in the United States in terms of operations, are all within 20 miles of each other. And the operation at each airport is certainly influenced by how the others are operating. And we've had projects that have required construction at LaGuardia that have required Kennedy to operate in a certain manner while LaGuardia is closed in order to allow while the project is being undertaken at LaGuardia, which would require runway closure. In order to allow the other runway to continue to operate, it would require Kennedy to operate in a certain fashion and vice versa. Same thing for Newark and Teterboro. And when we do that NEPA analysis, we do consider the operational changes at the other airport. It is a connected action under NEPA. And one of the things when you're examining a project under the National Environmental Policy Act is that you have to consider the full scope, including all related and connected actions to the measure being considered. So in that sense, we would consider multiple airports. But the common thread that we hear is, I live near this airport, but I do get overflights from the other airport. And in that sense, that's not always necessarily considered. The current standard for airport contour development is 65 DNL. We do have airports that generate contours beyond that. We do grade point analyses beyond that. But in terms of the standard for contours is that we, in terms of the 65, is that even in areas of congested airports like New York, I mentioned, Southern California, the Bay Area, any metropolitan area that has a large aggregation of airports within a closely identified geographic area, the 65 contours actually don't overlap. Once you start getting beyond 65, maybe down to the 55, you might see some overlapping occurring at that point. But as for now, the current policy is 65 DNL. 65 DNL contours don't overlap. You would not consider operations. Again, also one thing to consider is the way noise itself is measured and why we would not do this. Noise is exposure to noise events, and the way it's calculated is logarithmic, not arithmetic. So when you have two noise events at a same level, say 65 and 65, the aggregate exposure is actually 68. It's not 130. And the greater distance between the two events, the less the top number changes. So those overflights that you're hearing, yes, we're not saying that you cannot hear them, that you're not experiencing them, but the noise value of those overflights in comparison to the flights from the more proximate airport are at least 10 decibels lower. And at that range, when you add those two events, it actually doesn't increase the noise exposure of the higher event. So the higher event will always win out, and that'll be your noise exposure when you aggregate it. So for that reason, again, given the current regulatory environment, we would not consider overflights in our analyses given our current standards. To touch on the question about what policies, if any, limit the number of small airports in a specific area, our primary mission is to support the National Airspace System, the NAS, and airports. We do that via overseeing the National Program Integrated Airport Systems, or NIPIAS. And in that National Program for Integrated Airport Systems, all of the airports that currently receive federal funding have to be within identified and listed in the NIPIAS. That doesn't mean that every single airport all around is within the NIPIAS, just those that are obligated to and are recipients of federal funding, and those that we have regulatory authority over are within the NIPIAS. So there may be smaller strips, a community near you, maybe a fly-in community where, they all have a bunch of houses and, their garages are actually hangars and they take their hangar out, and instead of being all around a golf course, they go and they fly off on their. Those types of airports actually are not regulated by the FAA. They're not within the NIPIUS. They don't get access to our funding. So there's no real limits on those type of airports. But if one of those airports wants to join into the NIPIUS, or a new airport is looking to be developed, we would consider airports in the area. The standard is, we want to ensure service. Typically, we're looking at things like improving emergency service access to more remote areas. And the rule of thumb is 30 nautical miles. If there's no other NIPIUS airport within 30 nautical miles, certainly we still review and consider it. But if there is another one, it kind of has to meet a higher standard of justification to meet a new entrant requirement. But in terms of, those areas where there are existing airports within the NIPIUS, certainly within 30 nautical miles, I've given several examples already, we do not take them out. They seek to come out of their own accord. Thank you, Don.
Thanks, Andrew. I think, Adam, do you mind adding a little bit more about the multi-airport analytical component of ADT that came from NEARS?
Sure. I mean, one thing just to note is that where we do have these projects where we do look at multiple airports together, if there's some kind of related action between the two, we do have the capability to evaluate that in our current modeling software, which is the Aviation Environmental Design Tool, or AEDT. And previously, prior to moving to AEDT, we had a couple of legacy noise models, which was the integrated noise model, which was more for the airport noise specific, around the vicinity of airports. And then we had the noise integrated routing system, or NEARS, which, looked at, more airspace type actions, and from airport to airport type actions, the en route portion, and further away from the airport. And when, in the development of AEDT, we brought both of those pieces kind of together, both from I&M and from AEDT, the airport level component and more the en route airspace component, into one model. So we do have the capability to do that, airspace wide modeling, especially looking, below like 18,000 feet, for example. That's all into one tool now, where previously we had two separate tools that kind of did, different portions of that, depending on the type of the action that was done. So you can model multiple airports within, AEDT if there's a project that warrants it.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, I see a couple questions about advanced air mobility that I'm gonna take a shot at addressing. One was asking about advanced air mobility and how they're coming, and how we can allow that to happen given there's already existing noise issues, and whether they'll be addressed by the noise policy review. And I think the answer to that one is simply, we're certainly interested in your thoughts. We have some specific questions related to new entrants, and are very interested in our stakeholders' thoughts on those aircraft and how they relate to the noise policy. In addition, the Department of Transportation just published a request for information on advanced air mobility. They published that in the Federal Register as well, and there's another 53 days open for comment. So if folks are interested in sharing views to that Federal Register notice, I'd encourage you to do so as well. The other part about it, advanced air mobility, there is another question regarding whether the new technologies are going to be subject to regulation for all aspects, including noise. And I think that's a question we can answer in the context of type certification. So I think many of these aircraft are seeking, or the manufacturers of these aircraft are seeking a type certificate for those aircraft, and all type certificated aircraft that operate in the United States are required to comply with our 14 CFR Part 36, which is our noise certification standards. So they have to meet the limits in Part 36. If we have an aircraft that's presented for a TC or noise certification that doesn't really, the requirements in Part 36 don't really apply for some reason, we have the ability to publish a rule of particular applicability. And that rule would develop a standard that would apply only to that aircraft model. Usually when we approach a rule of particular applicability, we look at what we have and modify it to the extent needed so it can apply to the aircraft that's before us. And then in addition to that, as FAA makes decisions regarding these new entrants, if we have any federal action associated with the introduction of these aircraft, those federal actions undergo environmental review. So that's another place where the noise impacts, as well as all of the other environmental impacts of these kind of aircraft, would be considered by the agency. Okay, next question here. Adam, maybe you can take a shot at this one. This commenter says there's a bit of a catch-22. The FAA has not funded much or has done little research that's shown the weakness or limitations of DNL or data, a number above, to be representative of noise from away from the airport. How is this being addressed in the noise policy review process?
Sure. So the first thing I would note about that question is that, we did have a Federal Register notice in 2021 about our research efforts, and was seeking input on additional areas that we should, do research. And the overwhelming response was, and we got over 4,000 comments, as I think was noted, was that for the FAA to act on the research we've already done and stop doing research. That being said, that doesn't mean that we've stopped doing research, and obviously we continue to do a lot of research through various different avenues, one of which is our ASCENT program and Aviation Sustainability Center of Excellence for the environment, which has some research ongoing that's looking into various different things. One of the areas is looking at our tools and improving them. We mentioned a little bit about AEDT earlier, the Aviation Environmental Design Tool. And we have a lot of projects ongoing that are looking to improve aspects of that, which include, looking at noise, away from the airport. But separate from that, addressing that in this policy review process, one of the questions that we have in the Federal Register notice is about, what we should base looking at, metrics and thresholds and how we should set those off of, and what bodies of research we should look at, and input on what additional research areas we should be looking at, and, for informing our policy. And we invite comments on that as part of the docket. And one of those areas could be too, areas where there is research missing. We'll certainly consider those comments. And consistent with the 2021 Federal Register notice, there were some comments looking at health and sleep impacts that have helped guide, the expansion of some of our research under ASCENT today, because we've expanded it to look at additional things such as like, adiposity or obesity, or, also considering looking at other health impacts such as, diabetes, for example, which we're starting to do now through our ASCENT programs, and also looking at, our national sleep study, which, is ongoing. So, what I would just say to this and how it will be addressed in this review process, I think is, depending on what comments we get from the docket, we'll certainly look at our research efforts and where areas that pertain to that, and see what additional research potentially we may pursue. And also we have the neighborhood environmental survey that we did, and we may look as a result of this policy effort or policy review effort to mine that for additional data, which depending on the comments, maybe could be looking at number above, for example, in the context of that, those survey respondents, maybe we'll look at other metrics as well. So, I think, as part of this effort, we're certainly will entertain looking at the comments we receive and what, maybe additional research we may want to consider.
Thank you, Adam. Next question. Next Gen and this person's location really blew up long-range compatible land use planning. How can residents and local governments plan ahead for best land use when flight paths change without stakeholder inclusion? Sounds like maybe a Ryan or an Andrew question.
Okay, I'll start off and then Andrew can certainly.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I'll just say that, airspace changes, flight path changes is not a simple process. It has to follow a very regimented step-by-step process. And with the overarching theme here is that, safety of the NAS is the most important part. keeping planes separated, keeping them safe, making sure that folks get to locations as they intend to be is the ultimate goal for all of our actions. And I know sometimes, I know we're talking about noise here, but that is one of the things that in air traffic we really, it's a paramount importance to make sure that we have safety as the goal for all of our actions. But when you look at a complex airspace, there are so many intricacies between different flight paths from different airports, from different arrivals and departures, and having to keep those separated. You've got terrain. Terrain is a huge issue. I know in the West and in the East, there's a lot of issues that have to go into this process. But I will say that as far as including stakeholders, and when I mention stakeholders, there's the group. There's not a specific group that I'm talking about. It could be the airport sponsor, it could be community groups, it could be roundtables, it could be whatever it is. Those are the groups that that we in the environmental process have to consider, and it is a consideration in the NEPA process. And so, like I mentioned before, we have the 1050 order that outlines how we have to do our environmental analysis, and so we go through those categories and we look at, like I mentioned before, historic properties, national parks, wildlife refuges, all those kinds of things have to be considered. So I know I've heard from a lot of communities that, just put it over in that open area that's it's great, there's no one living there and it's wonderful, but a lot of times those are national parks, or they're recreational areas or wilderness areas, and so they're preserved for their quiet qualities. So there's things like that we really have to consider in this whole mix of analysis and engagement. The CEOs, I know we've mentioned them in previous ones. Those are the community engagement officers, and each region has a whole number of, the regional office has a number of them assigned, and those are really our eyes and ears on the ground, and those are the folks that engage on a consistent basis with the roundtables, with elected officials, with congressionals, airports. They are a lot of times the liaison between different parts of the FAA and those outside entities. And we've got some valuable information from them, because during our environmental review, we have to consider controversy. And that is one component that we have to bring in. And the CEOs, as we call them, community engagement officers, are a valuable asset to be able to say, yes, we understand that there's concerns about this new procedure. We've talked to the airport doesn't support it, or the roundtable has a lot of concerns. Is there something you can do to change the project? And those opinions and those interests are always brought as considerations in our decisions as we move forward with any of the airspace changes. So I understand, as far as planning goes, there's been some challenges. I think we've attempted to address them, but I think this is a good opportunity to bring those kind of comments up so that you can go back and say, well, this didn't work in this situation. We think there may be a better way to do it. And this is that opportunity. Andrew, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. I agree. But looking for better opportunities to improve our coordination with land use planning is certainly something that I personally feel would be great if we could identify that via the noise policy review process. And one thing I do want to say is, over my career in this agency, I've had the opportunity to engage with land use planners in a variety of projects in a variety of fashions, and I do not envy the competing interests that they need to navigate in their day-to-day life and role. One thing, just to kind of clarify is, land use planning is not something that the FAA has authority over. It's not something that the federal government has authority over, and oftentimes it's a state issue that's delegated to a county or a local municipality, and there's wide deviance, I guess, for lack of a better term, between how different municipalities surrounding airports apply their land use planning standards. And certainly a challenge for us in working with airports and working on policy changes and working on ensuring compatible land use to the degree that we can is navigating all those various requirements. One thing I do want to say is that the majority of the projects that we fund via the Airport Improvement Program, we have to make a determination that the project is consistent with the plans of local land use authorities. Airport sponsors that receive grants are obligated under what we call grant assurances. There's 39 grant assurances that they need to meet, and these are requirements that they need to continue to meet in order to not only not have to pay us back for the money they've received, but continue to be eligible for future funding. And one of those is to demonstrate to the degree that they can compatibility with local land use. And then a third avenue that we engage in our program with land use planning is via the Part 150 process. That process is compatible planning. That the entire goal of that process is to establish means to reduce non-compatible land use, mitigate that which you can't reduce, and then prevent anything from the future entering in terms of ensuring non-compatible land use. And we've had wonderful experiences with land use planning agencies that are very interested in pursuing things like noise overlay zones. I can speak to, like, the state of Maryland has a requirement where their airports have to update their overlay zones on a 5-year basis. Albany in New York, the capital, the airport authority up there for the capital region in New York has requirements to adopt airport overlay zones. And what those are is that they are updates to the noise exposure levels on a recurring basis to inform their local municipalities that are responsible for land use planning. And so that they're informed and that they're ensuring from a local land use planning perspective that they're doing what they can to ensure that only land uses compatible with noise exposures are being proposed in those areas. And then we have airport authorities like MWA Dulles, which is doing a lot of land use compatibility planning in terms of sharing noise exposure maps, but they've had some procedure changes in the last few years, and those procedure changes unfortunately were timed in a way between some of their updates to their land use compatibility planning, wherein new communities had grown in certain areas, despite concerns that were raised. And so this is one of the dynamics that we need to navigate and hopefully develop more successful strategies to navigate, is to bring the land use planners to the table in a meaningful and productive fashion, so that they get on board and incorporate planning to ensure that no new residential exposures or no other non-compatible type land uses are included within these areas around airports. And there has been a reluctance from many land use authorities at local levels in many communities that I've dealt with to engage in that, because they're trying to balance the protection of the area versus residential development pressure or economic interest, or having to apply standards for aviation noise to all modal noise, which means train noise and car noise and transit noise and all these other modes of transportation, and it's just a struggle. And honestly, I really think in terms of being successful in the future, an implementation of noise policy review is certainly one aspect that we need to focus on, is better engagement and better buy-in from land use planning authorities. So that's my piece. So thank you, Don.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, let's see, next question. I think we're going to go back to advanced air mobility. It's been occurring, advanced air mobility, or AAM, has been occurring and growing behind the scenes without the general public's knowledge or understanding of what's coming. AAM, and again, I'm just reading from the commenter. AAM is a new entrant that will be extremely low at 350 feet above ground level and stacked under other aircraft, causing cumulative impacts. How will FAA develop noise metrics and thresholds that will consider the vast potential numbers of aircraft, the extreme low altitudes above neighborhoods and parks, and the effect of multiple layers of stacked aircraft on calculating cumulative noise? Aside from number above, how do you or we expect the public to provide us with noise metrics for an unknown commodity? And I guess, that's a great question. It's a difficult one, but certainly a relevant one as we're looking at new entrants coming online within the National Airspace System. And it's certainly relevant to the topic that we have in front of us, the noise policy review. We noted in our Federal Register notice that these operations are coming and are likely going to change the character of how people experience aircraft noise, and could change, could expose some communities that already experience aviation activity to different kinds of noise. And it also could expose communities that don't have a lot of aircraft noise to new noise. These operations are more likely to be distributed, and as the commenter noted, they're likely to operate at lower altitudes. I mentioned before, but I have a little more information in front of me now. The Department of Transportation is seeking public input on the development of a national strategy on advanced air mobility that was required by the Advanced Air Mobility Coordination and Leadership Act. The Department of Transportation has formed a team composed of multiple executive branch agencies that are seeking and will review input on a variety of topics to inform the development of that strategy. You can review the type of input that's sought on the notice on the Federal Register using the document citation on the Register's website, 88FR 31593. That's 88FR 31593, and docket number DOT-OST-2023-0079. With regards to our noise in this policy review, there's a number of things that we want input on as we think through the issues. How could we employ metrics to analyze these operations, and what should those metrics disclose? Do we have the right tools and methodologies to do the net analysis that's needed? In the absence of scaled and mature operations, should there be interim standards that we revisit in a few years once we have better understanding of how and when and where these operations are occurring, or how loud they are, what they sound like? Or should once research into the analysis tools has evolved, is that when we should be doing something? So I think there's a number of areas where we could get are interested in seeking input, both on our noise policy review Federal Register notice, as well as the broader advanced air mobility Federal Register notice that was published by the Department of Transportation. So we've got just a couple minutes left. I think, let's see, we have one more question. I would ask our panelists to be brief, but I was hoping that each of us had a chance to weigh in on this one. So if you could just limit your response to a minute or a little less, that would be great. And the question is, if the things that we're talking about are not going to lower noise, why are we even doing this noise policy review? Let's see, I think last time we did reverse alphabetical order. So we're going to go in normal alphabetical order by first name, and that puts Adam up first.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons we're doing this policy review, and that as we've talked about a lot through these webinars, that we don't have the ability to single-handedly address noise concerns related to aviation. But that being said, our role and our goal is to do everything within our authority to reduce noise and emissions while ensuring, the safest airspace in the world. But what does that look like in the real world if there's no action the FAA we can take to immediately reduce noise, like turning down the dial on a radio, as you've noted? But we have a lot of efforts that are ongoing and complementary. One of the things is getting better information through research on how noise impacts communities, finding the best options to understand and disclose noise experienced by communities in various areas. And that's really where the metrics come in. and being able to look at different metrics and maybe communicate to that better. And it also involves ensuring that we're relying on and the public has access to the best information that's available. And that, our research has told us already that the Schultz curve is no longer representative of community annoyance. And we believe it's important for us to rely on relevant and more accurate information in our policy and information that's up to date. And the NPR is really going to help us address that.
Okay, Andrew, you're next. We got just a couple seconds, please.
Sure. I just want to say, looking forward, the more information we have, the better communication tools we have, the better decisions that we can make and the public can, walk away with a more meaningful understanding of noise impacts. And, hopefully that'll inform everything going forward and that we won't be, perpetuating the sins of the past, if you will, that, we'll have a better position to handle these issues as we move forward. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Andrew. Ryan, any quick additions?
Do I have 10 seconds? Okay, I have 10. All right.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, this is a really big deal. This is a huge deal for the FAA to change this policy, be looking at it. So folks should be submitting comments. It's great. We're getting a lot of questions, but I'll just say a couple things. One is this could change project decisions. In the end, the decision to move ahead of the project might be changed. It could change how information is shared, meaning more information could be shared, and it could be new and additional type of analysis could inform people better about what the changes are farther away from the airport.
Awesome. Thank you all. I'm going to skip my thoughts. I think you all did a great job with the question. Thank you all for joining us today, both the panel and all of our participants, and also for your flexibility regarding the timing of the meeting. Hopefully the way that we address the difference in timings worked for everyone. We hope that our presentation and our responses have been helpful and help improve your understanding of the things that we're looking for. Please submit your comments to our docket on regulations.gov. That's docket number FAA-2023-0855. Due to time constraints, even over our 3-hour webinar today, we weren't able to get to all the comments and all of the questions. If you joined us partway through, the recording will be posted online. You can reach that at faa.gov/noise policy review. All of our webinars are up online at this point. Thank you again to everyone who joined us today for all of our webinars and for all the folks on the FAA team for helping make this a possibility. Thank you all. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.